Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 2. This video has been in the making for quite some time now, but it's definitely been worth it. I've been working on it for about 4 months, scripting, editing, memorizing, but these subjects are as thorough as I could make them. Today we're going to be exploring subjects which are in drama, literature, literary criticism with, Greek and Hebrew, but even some other really interesting domains such as biology, evolution, psychophysiology, as well as psychology with cognitive dissonance, ego-syntonicity. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I really think you will. Genesis 2 is a very thorough, it's a fat chapter. So I've given it my all. It's like a 3-hour lecture, 3-hour videos. So maybe it's for documentation. Maybe you guys will actually enjoy it. Maybe it's for someone in the future. Who knows? But Genesis 2 has been a really, really interesting time, and I hope to see you guys at the end of the video. So, shalom, peace, till next time. The title that I'm going to be using is Perek Bet, an exploration of Genesis 2, narrated and composed by JSS. So let's get to it. This is the outline. This will take us through the topics that we're going to be going through. So we're going to be going through functional ontology, agriculture, arustarachelis, hanachash, psychophysiology, sexuality, imago Dei, femininity in Nitzala, ezer kenegdo, ish and isha, pluripotentiality, egosyntonic versus egodystonic, distinguishing sex and gender, and finally, questions and tendential thoughts. So this is our outline. If you want to use it for future reference, feel free. But this is going to be guiding us through this lecture. All right, let's get into this goodness. So yeah, let's begin with the first thing, first chapter, first idea, which is functional ontology, which includes systemization, relationality, utility, meaning, and existence. So it's really interesting, right? Chapter 2 of Genesis is not the only account of creation, right? You have chapter 1 and then you have chapter 2, which are both accounts of a creation. Different sequential orders, different histories, different times at which things are created, right? So for example, humans are created first in the second account, whereas humans are created last, right? And so the second account of creation is typically referred to by scholars as the Yahwist account, out of the JPED 4 editors of Genesis and the Torah. So chapter 2 is pretty interesting, especially looking at cosmology as not necessarily a historical, empirical, scientific account of creation, but rather a account from the Mesopotamians' perspective of functional ontology. So let's explore this idea of functional ontology, give definition to it, and also explore its relationship to nomenclature. So, the vital ontological category found within Mesopotamian cosmology, which also includes the Hebrews, uses what is referred to as functional ontology. Functional ontology states that existence is based on an object's function, that being its, quote, the activity or purpose natural to or intended for a person or thing, end quote. So its ability to perform according to its ascribed function or purpose, right? Functional ontology proposes that order is based on an entity's ability for integration within a larger system. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the desert and sea are prime examples of uncontrollable forces, chaos and destruction, thus incapable forces, being able to be attributed, of being able to contribute to human society. However, it is not the role of humans, however, it is the role of humans through agriculture to subdue and control such forces, turning arid deserts into gardens and orchards. This we will see and we're going to look at this a little bit more in the section of agriculture. So it's interesting, right? You have at the beginning of creation, um, the phrase tohu vavohu, right? Chapter 1. Now this is focusing on chapter 2, but chapter 1, tohu vavohu, typically translated in English as nothingness and void, or emptiness and void, darkness and void, but it more literally, concretely translates to um, um, aridness and desolation, um, sort of like a desert, um, like an underwater desert, um, a sea desert in some sense. Waters which just go for miles and miles, which have nothing within them. Um, so yeah, yeah, that's pretty much it. So it's not necessarily that the Hebrew is saying, okay, before space-time even existed, right? He or she is really more saying, okay, we're not necessarily going to focus on the aestheticism of the universe. We're going to focus more so on the utility of the universe. And when utility, systemization, relationality, um, all began to come into play. With our ontology, the primal waters and desert are understood as a form of non-existence because they cannot be integrated within a human system, right? You can't integrate a tsunami into, at least according to the technology that they had, as something useful, right? You couldn't integrate the desert into something that was useful according to the nomadic technology that they had. From our modern ontology, we recognize primal water and desert as existing materials, such as our empirical mode of space-time, right? So when we think of creation, we typically think of the laws of nature which existed before space-time itself came into being, right? But that's not necessarily what the Hebrew is saying. We also think of, when we think of waters, primal waters, we think of sodium chloride, oxygen, hydrogen bonds, sand, silica, different mineral composites. Yet to the ancient Hebrew, that which could not be integrated as contributing to the ordered system represented what we would conceptualize today as nothingness. In some sense, what is not able to be utilized doesn't necessarily exist. Or at least in some sense, it does not bring about any form of life, right? It's dead water. On a similar note, nomenclature is deeply involved with functional ontology. The naming of an entity from the ancient mind was attributed differently than how it is today. So let's look at how it was used back then in some sense as a typical example from the most famous cosmological account, that being the Enuma Elish. In the Enuma Elish, for example, in ancient Babylonian cosmology, notice the emphasis on naming before the material world is described as being formed. Quote, the first tablet. When in the heights heaven was not yet named. 1. And the earth beneath did not yet bear a name. 2. And the primeval Apsu who begat them, and Chaos, Tiamat, mother of them both. The waters were mingled together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen, when none of the gods have been called into being. So called in a sense is named. None bore named, 4. And no destinies were ordained. End quote. So there's this emphasis on calling, naming, um, calling and naming, which have to do with a state of existence, a role, a characterization, right? Systemization, which is pretty interesting. Today, we name people combinations of random sounds as unique mixtures, simply referring to the material entity, right? The ancients, however, and this is a widespread occurrence. It's not necessarily exclusive to Mesopotamia or the Middle East. It's found in Mesoamerica, it's found in Africa, it's found in virtually most hunter-gatherer societies. So the ancients, however, gave title-like names, even to what we would now conceptualize as inanimate objects. As I've studied a little bit of Nawat, um, some things that in the English world would be thought of as inanimate are given animate suffixes. Hills, for example, are given animate words for hills or words for particular rocks or minerals. And it's very interesting. The ancients, however, gave title-like names even to what we would now conceptualize as inanimate objects. This mode of naming addresses less of the simple aesthetics, composition, and forms of the entity, but rather the entity's behavior, purpose, and a role in relation to an integrated system. Today, there is a large distinction between names and words, right? In the English mind, there is a distinction between names and words. Yet to the ancients, their nomenclature largely placed these two categories into the same category, thus becoming virtually synonymous. Names and words, in some sense, were not necessarily distinguished. You sort of had a word for everything, to be sort of poetic. A name word. That is why ancient people can bear names composed of inanimate objects. To have names addressing various rocks, minerals, colors, plants, animals, or materials because of the quality of the character, operated similarly to how the object mentioned in their name was used throughout daily life, right? Or associated with as a euphemism. On a gradient, the animate and humans typically possess a name bearing their dominant behavior, whereas the name of an inanimate thing typically describes its composition. So, for example, that's why you hear a typical example of this would be a Native American name. You have something like Flint Sky, or Red Eagle, um, Skyhawk, right? Something like that. Black Bear. Um, if you have someone with Flint Sky, they're obviously not Flint, and rather Flint describes the essence of that, or not necessarily essence, but the abstract usage of what Flint does, right? Flint is sharp. Flint is a useful tool for cutting. Um, it perhaps distinguishes things from one another, right? So maybe flint would be used as a euphemism for someone who is good at distinguishing, and sky would be a euphemism for something that is calm, maybe something that is cool, collected, maybe something that is even heavenly, right? So you have obviously not a flint sky, or a flint that falls from the sky, but you have more so a abstracted um, recognition of a dominant attribute of their character that can be seen throughout the generalized through in a generalized sense through a mineral, the way a mineral is utilized, or the way air is sensed, or something of that nature, right? Which I think is pretty interesting. Now today we just have names like Jim, Carl, or whatever, right? Um, so pretty interesting. It's notable. So a typical example of this would be, think of the difference in meaning between the words house and home. The word house focuses on the aesthetics of the materials used and how they were arranged. A home focuses on what the objects are purposed for. To extend the analogy, think of a man who has just walked into a play and he's late, right? And I'm getting this example from Bible Hub. He asks the person to the right of him, what did I miss, right? And they respond, oh, well, the wood on the stage was shipped from here, right? And then he says, no, no, no. What did I miss? So then he asks another person, okay, what did I miss? They reply, the building was founded in. He's like, no. Then he asks another person, what did I miss? They reply, the cast was selected by, right? So then he finally asks the question, okay, what have I missed since the curtains opened? So the Hebrew is asking, what have I missed since the curtains opened? Western culture um, typically asks, what have I missed since, typically asks the previous questions, right? What was the cast selected by? What was the wood of the stage? Where was it collected and harvested from? Right, things of that nature, which is pretty cool. So takeaways from this aspect of functional ontology is that nomenclature has a deep role in relationship with existence. Something that is named is something that exists. Something that is not named is something that does not necessarily exist, at least from a ancient, more hunter-gatherer perspective, right? When you come across a poison dart frog, you don't even know what to call it. You come across it and you're starving. If you don't know what that thing is and you are starving and you eat it, you don't know if you're going to die or not. You don't know if you're going to get poisoned. Or for example, if you come across a plant and you're starving, you don't know the name of the plant. Typically, plants aren't in ancient languages, such as Nahuatl. Plants aren't even necessarily named, sort of like the way we do Botanicus, Elecanthus, Momantis, whatever, right? They're usually named something like um, diarrhea helper, or toothache soother, something like that. If you come across a plant and you're starving, you don't know the name of it, there's a chance you're going to die because you don't know the name. So it's not necessarily that because something doesn't exist as a material entity, it's not necessarily because something simply exists as a material entity and it's not named that it doesn't exist. It's more so that if something is not named, that it has a likelihood of not being able to attribute to human existence, right? And life as a general whole, at least from the perspective of a human, right? So pretty interesting stuff. Let's move on. I have here 3 pictures. One is of humans looking into the cosmos. The middle is a person speaking with other people. And the third to the right is a person looking at themselves in the mirror. And so I'm sort of just thinking about Genesis 2, or Genesis 1, 2, and 3 as a sort of, I don't even know how to exactly explain it in one word, a zooming in of the worlds that we're surrounded by. So chapter 1 I'm proposing focuses on cosmic identity, cosmic order, water and darkness. What are humans in relation to the cosmos? What are humans in relation to the universe, right? Chapter 1 has a prime focus on the stars, right? Celestial beings, plants and animals, the world, right? The big world, in some sense, the cosmos. Chapter 2 has more of an emphasis on, oh yeah, chapter 1 is the macrocosm, right? Chapter 2 is more so of the meso, it's sort of in the middle, focuses on terrestrial order, and as I propose, the interpersonal identity, human beings in relation to each other, right? This is more of the social aspect of human to human. And then chapter 3, as I'm perhaps proposing, is the intrapersonal identity, the internal order, the microcosm of the individual. This has to do not so with human to human, but human in relation to its own self, the psyche, right? Ego, superego, and id, right? So chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and as the story progresses, it's almost a zooming in into nature, which I think is pretty cool. So, yeah. Genesis chapters 1 through 2, from the lens of functional ontology, seems to be concerned not necessarily with origin, but identity, thus exploring who we are, not necessarily what we are. Science focuses on the mechanism and aesthetics, whereas on mythology focuses on agency, meaning, purpose, utility, function. However, considering that man is first numbered by what woman is, as opposed to what she does, They indicate that humans are struggling to identify themselves in a state separate from their performance, right? So it's only after the fall that Adam is no longer enamored by what Isha is, but rather what she does. And so perhaps, in some sense, chapter 2 is it's looking at things as pure, sort of unadulterated from a an objectification of the universe, and more so an objectification of human nature, struggling to identify ourselves in terms of essence as opposed to experience, right? Our identity is not primarily rooted in what we do, but rather who we are, right? And so maybe that has to do with um, the shift in nomenclature, the shift in naming, and from the Mesopotamian perspective, the shift in perceptual existence from simply being woman, Isha, to Chava, life birther, right? To carry on, everything inanimate remaining under functional ontology, whereas Ish and Isha are to be rooted in their a priori essence. This misidentification of self through redefining, quote, woman as birther. This transition indicates objectification and the existentialism that comes from poor nomenclature. What one does, as being synonymous with work, forces the abstraction of essence from experience, one's consubstantiality with the divine from the accumulated persona, right? Being able to distinguish our accumulated experiences, all right, which are in fact an aspect of ourselves, but not letting that dominate and completely define who we are from an a priori perspective. Thus, as we shall see later, this can result from cognitive dissonance between authenticity versus absolutism on an intrapersonal level, right? Shalom versus totalitarianism, divine right, pathology on an intrapersonal, sorry, divine, sorry, Shalom versus totalitarianism, which is a divine right pathology on a interpersonal / intrapersonal level. But to carry on. On another ontological note, we asked if Yahweh can exist without a body. We concluded yes, although perhaps there is a realm of inexperience to God, when the flesh and spirit are separated. The a posteriori needs an a priori system, which can first, an a priori system, like us who first move then think about our thoughts. There is an embodied kinesthetic knowledge, which is then brought to an explicit articulation. From Jungian perspective, the dream moves from action into articulation. First there is the golem, and then there is the breath-like phenomena as that which constitutes actualization. That concludes this section on functional ontology. Let us now move on to agriculture. As a final thought, yeah, pretty much chapters 1, 2, and 3, in my perspective, seem to be zooming in on the nature in which we're surrounded by. First, it seems to indicate the most furthest nature, which is the cosmos, the universe. And then from this, that's chapter 1. And then from chapter 2, it seems to zoom a little bit further into the interpersonal world, which is human to human. And then as it moves on to chapter 3, it seems to zoom in even further into the human nature, which is human to human. This is id, ego, and superego, the interpersonal world. And in some sense, before we get psychology, you have spiritual nomenclature. In the interpersonal world, in some sense, it's really the world of the unification between the flesh and the spirit. And chapter 3 is the dramatization of that interpersonal world. So let's move on to agriculture. So this section is going to be focusing on agriculture, and the transition from a hunter-gatherer nomadic lifestyle to a domestication and systemization of the world. In some sense, the divine ordering of the world. And it's really interesting looking at who Yahweh is as a gardener, which in some sense is just simply a farmer. And so the divine farmer brings the desert and the primal sea into a state of systemization, and a systemization of these elements, which is a mastery of them, in a sense, is just simply a gardening, and a discovery of agriculture, and the divinity, the paradise that is associated with this beautiful form of ruling, rulership, and meaning, function, and purpose. So, yeah, let's explore this perspective a little bit. Right, so we talked a little bit about the primal sea, Tohu Vafohu. In the Mesopotamian perspective, as you can see in this demonstration on top, you see the primal ocean and the pillars of the earth. And here's not, I mean, obviously ancient people couldn't dive the way we dive, but ancient people were exposed to things like cenotes, underwater aquifers. In Zoroastrianism, which is one of the oldest forms of religion, in the Gathas of Zoroaster, in the prayers, there's these things which are mentioned as ganats, Qanatz, which were, in a sense, there were types of wells where people would drill into the earth, and they would find water, and they were, in some sense, when you would just dig into the earth, and you would find water, the further you went down, they would infer that the further you went down, well, there's just going to be a lot of water. So the way that they conceptualized the world would have been something similar to these images as found at the bottom. And when you get past the world, there's just going to be a lot of water. There's going to be salt water, fresh water, or there's going to be just salt water. But the purpose of God is to bring the salt water into through the earth, and which is a sort of purification, as is seen in aquifers, which is pretty cool, because aquifers purify water through limestone and other forms of rocks, such as pumice, and create life through that, which is create springs, create aquifers, create aids, as we will see, and this is the role of human beings. So you have the tohu vavohu, you have the chaotic sea, you have the chaotic desert, the arid desert, which is then brought into which has within it an oasis of some sort, and the role of humans is to sort of take advantage of this oasis and turn it and turn the world into an oasis, turn sort of this little cenote into a paradise, which is pretty cool. So I'm just going to go through some thoughts on what this sort of idea of agriculture brings about, which is brought about in chapter 2. So let's get to it. So I'm going to go on a few little tangents and then pick back up. So, agriculture. If sacrifice is of God and agriculture is of God, could it then be synonymous that agriculture is sacrifice? This question we want to explore. The imagery of the paradesa appears to be influenced from nomadic hunter-gatherers transitioning into an agrarian lifestyle. The imagery also seems to have influenced how they conceptualized paradise and developed their theology from this. Rather than a literal account, this cosmology reflects a psychological attitude towards work, comforting the existentialism of toil with an a priorist purpose. So in some sense, a little child asks his father, Dad, why do we have to be out in the field all day? Why do we have to do agriculture? Why do we have to garden? Why do we have to do all this? Why don't we just go and, kill some deer or whatever? Why don't we just do that? Why do we have to subject ourselves to this degree of order? And the father replies, well, because Yahweh wants us to um, maintain his garden, right? In some sense. And so there's this a priorist sort of latent learning that is conveyed by the editors, which would comfort that child's existentialism. Why do I have to be toiling in the field? Why do I have to sweat by the brow? Well, it's because in the beginning, God had a vision for the world to be a garden, to be agriculture. We messed up, so we gotta bring it back to that state, And so it's like, oh, okay, because it was like that in the beginning, um, so it is too now, or so it is as well now, right? So paradise and delight are described of in terms of food, a land flowing with the fats of milk and the sugar of honey, implicit for the necessary nutrients required to sustain a nomadic, active lifestyle. Quick little thought. One thing I've also been thinking about is how um, all throughout Genesis, God says, "Peru urufu umilu," be fruitful, multiply, and increase upon the earth. Right. The first word Peru has a relationship in etymology with the word peri, which is fruit. So I'm wondering if there's a relationship between Peru and peri throughout chapters 1 and 2, in that chapter 1 says be fruitful, and chapter 1 says be fruitful. Chapter 2, quoting God, says don't eat the fruit, which I'm speculating may be synonymous for something like don't be fruitful, don't engage in the act of fruitfulness, which is to be engage in intimacy of some sort. So there's this sort of poetic hinting at towards perhaps sin as a sexual act, or a metasexual sin. Sin is described as a metasexual act of some sort. Anyways, though, a land flowing with fats of milk and the sugar of honey, right? The sugar, the fructose of fruits, right? All this imagery produced from the. So this is able to be produced from the invention and discovery of agriculture, carbs, fats, sugars, which become readily more accessible through agriculture, thus increasing time spent towards rest, socialization, contemplation, and perhaps on a level of nutrition equating to a level of consciousness, leading to a deeper awareness of God. So as the people transition from, as you can see in this picture, from hunter-gatherer societies, from nomadic societies, and enter systemization, enter gardening, enter agriculture, they create cities which, for the first time in history, really more deeply aid contemplation, which more deeply aids the formation of theology, formation of the awareness of God. And so it's this really interesting process that develops, right? Because you can't think when you're starving. All you can think about is, right? It's almost as though where God dwells is where there is an abundance of fats, which is from milk, and an abundance of fructose, which is a form of sugar from honey and other various forms of fruit, right? And God dwells in paradise where there is a land flowing of milk and honey. So it's pretty interesting, in some sense. And there's also this dependency. It is as though humanity's entry into existence is conditional towards the ability to foster herbs, plants, and fruits of all kinds. So it's right. God says in Hebrew, "Ve'adam ein la'avo Here's how it goes in Hebrew. It goes Veshiach terem yiyeh va'aretz ve'esev terem yiyeh terem yitmach ki lo himtir Yahweh Elohim al haaretz ve'adam ein la'avod et ha'adamah. Right. So it says before the things sprouted, before seeds and all that thing came up, God had not watered these things had not sprouted because God had not watered the earth, because, in some sense, human beings could not till it. So there's this dependency for humanity, or there's this dependency between the emergence of human beings and the emergence of um, botanical life. And it's almost as though, perhaps indirectly, or it's just as it could be inferred indirectly, just as plants, or just as humans cannot become into being because plants cannot be cultivated, so too, because plants cannot be cultivated, humans cannot come into existence. And so obviously we know from the human record, humans have existed. Homo erectus and Homo sapien have existed millions, have been on the earth for millions of years. It's more so the conceptualization of what a human is in a more deeper theological sense, in that a human is it's more so like a deeper notion of what a human is relative to the time of agriculture, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. From the intake of greater nutrition, humans could better deepen their relationship with the transcendent. Through sacrifice, an individual is better able to conserve resources, save seed for the next harvest, the projected world of the future, right? And so sacrifice cannot come into play. Consequentiality, causality cannot come into play from agriculture, which is dependent on all those things. All those things cannot come into play as much as it can from the level of the nomadic or hunter-gatherer society, right? Because it requires a more thoughtful attitude, right? When you're engaging in gardening, when you're engaging in agriculture, when you're engaging in drilling aquifers and understanding all those things, you have to think about the future. You have to save seed. You can't just eat it at that moment and then go walk somewhere else. You have to stay in a place, and and by staying in a place, you have to think about the future, and that has a big role with consequentiality and consciousness, prefrontal lobe. We're going to explore these things more. Jeez, I can't talk. Questions I'm asking in this, from these ideas about the transition from hunter-gatherers to hunter-gatherers and nomads to agriculture and gardeners, is: did agriculture strengthen the prefrontal cortex? First mentioned describing the transfer from a nomadic hunter-gatherer to that of an agrarian. Did agriculture aid a notion of self and God simultaneously, or more deeply? Is there a symbiosis or a mutual edification? It's interesting to note why there are no sprouts of the field when there is no man to work. Yet can be said vice versa, no man when there is no work to be done. The name Adam, here's moving forward. The name Adam as a composite noun may have an additional definition of characteristic by mention of the aid. Adama and Demut are within this composite, which already define what a human is. Right, so you have Demut, which is similitude or likeness, attribute. It's more the attributeness that is shared between God and man, right? So you have the attribute, demut, then you have the adama, which is the more material, aesthetic, formal nature of the human. But then you have another word, which is aid, which means mist or vapor, or spring. It could be thought of as a cenote or an aquifer. From Bible Hub, quote, the same as oud in the sense of enveloping, a fog, mist, vapor. Bible Project describes the saturating substance as an ordered form of tohu vavohu. From a Mesopotamian perspective, there is water below and above the earth. In the right proportion, the chaotic substance may now enable life. So we talked a little bit about the Gathas of Zoroaster. And so it's almost as though a human, or from the perspective of the moment that one is existing in the agricultural world, what defines a human is its relationship to the aquifer, to a cenote, to a spring. Because a human in this society is dependent on, it's almost as though a human cannot be formed, or the domesticated human cannot be formed without the cenote, without the aquifer, without the ganat. And a defining aspect of what a Adam is from an aid. And an Adam cannot be formed without the aid of an aid, right? So pretty interesting stuff. I was going to go into all the stuff about the four rivers, but I think we can pass that. I'm just going to keep that documented in my notes. So let's move on to the next section, which is Aristoteles, which is the relationship between various forms of arousal and various forms of exposure, vulnerability, sensitivity. But concluding thoughts in this section are just that the transition from hunter-gatherer nomadic to agriculture and gardening seems to have had a significant relationship on the development of their theology, their awareness of God, and even the way that they defined themselves, literally phonologically, literally symmetrically, phonologically, with similar sounding words according to the pronunciation of their own name. Adam from Aid, which is a cenote, spring, or um, um, aquifer, well, in some sense. But yeah, pretty interesting stuff. So let's move on to the next section. This section is definitely my favorite section, and it demands a lot of attention. Its relationship between drama and biology, I think, is fascinating. I think, as of now, it appears to be somewhat of a phenomenon, I think, trying to understand the ambiguity of poetry and its relationship to our evolutionary history and our circuitry. But this section is titled Arustrachelis. This is a word that I'm coining to understand this phenomenon. As I try to understand, as I've said before, drama, the role of drama, dramatization, and our biology, and the literary motif which seems to approximate these two subjects together. So this section is Arustrachelis, and concerns the serpent, concerns psychophysiology, sexuality, metasexuality, seduction, causality, and sacrifice. So we're going to be breaking all these things down. We're going to be exploring the relationship to one another. And we're going to be exploring this word, which I'm deciding to coin because I can't find a word which seems to encapsulate these ideas into a simple, quick abstraction. So let's try and abstract it. So arustrachelis. This is a compound noun of two words, arousal and trachelizo. So let's first look at arousal. So the way I'm using arousal is not exclusively in a sexual sense. Although arousal, if I'm not mistaken, does not have a etymology with the word eros. But if it does, it quite nicely fits because obviously arousal can be used in a sense of coitus, but I'm trying to keep things serious. So there's eros, which poetically at least um, quite nicely fits with arousal. But you have acuity, stimulus, consciousness, stimulation. You have excitement as well, um, sensuality in some sense. And then you have the word trachelizo from a Raspian pronunciation, or traxelizo from the other one, which means to grab, which quite literally means to grab by the throat, and is a Greek euphemism, which really just means to be exposed, to open, to lay bare, um, to open, yeah, which means exposure. The way that I'm using it is the quote, um, the way that and this definition is changing because it's such a, as of now, it's a phenomenon, but it seems to be, as I quote, the typological motif with which demonstrates through various forms of exposure, various forms of trachelizo, the emergence of various forms of arousal. So the typological motif which brings about arousal through the exposure of trachelizo. So hence arus trachelis, right? So let's explore this word. How does this word have an actual concrete relationship to Genesis chapter 2, chapter 3, and even other typology throughout the narrative, but most archetypally um, through Genesis 2 and 3. So there is a composite of Hebrew words, and quite famously, as Hebrew operates, a Hebrew word doesn't typically exist alone by itself. A Hebrew word typically exists in a relationship phonologically and morphologically, quite similarly in a relationship to other Hebrew words. So in English, you can have a word like cup, which has no relationship to bowl in its phonology or its spelling, right? CUP, the consonants and vowels CUP are not even existent in the words BOWL, right? There's no correspondence. But Hebrew, if you have a word like bowl, you will, to a very high degree, have a word which um, will have a word like cup, which is also spelled and pronounced very similarly. There's always nuance, of course, but there's always similarity, and this similarity needs to be given attention. So the way this composite works is sort of like a gem, or like a mineral. There's other chemicals which are existing in the environment, but they are contextualizing the words which are present. So you have the words present in the chapters of 1 and present in the chapters of 2 and 3 are the words Aram, nakedness, and the word Aram, which is to be shrewd or crafty. Now, throughout the narrative, there are other words, but in order, obviously, to best understand a word, you need to understand that word in relationship to other words, because we're not even dealing with English. We're dealing with a whole different ontological, what is that word? Philological set of words. So, all in all, there is a composite. So let's look at this composite. So notice the how closely related they sound to each other. Notice how closely related they are spelled to one another. This is phonology. This is morphology, right? So you have arum, crafty, prudent, subtle. This is an adjective. You have number 2, aram, to be shrewd or crafty. This is a verb. 3, erum, nakedness or nudity. This is an adjective. You have ur, to be exposed or bare. This is a verb. You have ur, pronounced exactly the same, used in a different sense, meaning to rouse oneself, to awake. Then you have ur, which means skin, leather, or hide, and that is a noun. So for a moment, I want to talk about this slide. We're going to come back to it later once we've explored more fully what the serpent is, because the serpent, in a sense, is a groundwork towards consciousness, arousal, arustirachelis. So just to get things going, these two phrases are what I'm proposing to be the best explanation towards the Hebrew composite of words associated with nakedness, skin, and so on and so forth. So here is how it goes. You ur to your Edom of Or when you are unable to be Aram, therefore becoming Ur to the Arum serpent. I'll say it again. You ur to your Edom of Or when you're unable to be Aram, therefore becoming Ur to the Arum serpent. So the direct translation of this, according to its actual parsing, goes in English, you wake up to your nakedness of skin when you are unable to be shrewd, therefore becoming exposed to the smooth serpent. So the agent, as you can see on the right, is the winged feline serpent. This is the cat snake bird. And it is the perfect entity for triggering our biological circuitry, our predatory biological circuitry. And so you have this entity, you have this subject, which is an agent towards causing acuity, towards causing consciousness, towards causing alertness, towards danger, right? So in the beginning you have the serpent, and the serpent causes, as an easily demonized figure, a state of acuity, a state of alertness, and indirectly a state of consciousness. So on the right you can see the winged feline serpent, the cat snake bird. In the middle you have a very soft, supple eye observing a large predatorial animal. And it is through this encounter of observation, through this encounter of proximity, that consciousness is created. So we're going to look at this a little bit more deeply. We're going to come back to this slide. But I just want to throw this out as we work through the bottom up of what the serpent is and build up from there. So let's get to it. In this moment now, we are going to be exploring Hanchash, the serpent. I want to look at the serpent as a character, I want to look at the serpent both as a character, as a form of drama and literature, as a dramatization itself of something, as well as looking at the serpent as a compository of humans' worst fears as a predator, as a winged feline serpent, or as a cat snake bird in a sense. So yeah, want to look at the serpent, explore the serpent, and this will aid us towards understanding Arustrachelis, because from the serpent we can then understand its relationship to consciousness as a foundation towards consciousness. So first I want to look at a few thoughts, take us a few thoughts, and then we're just going to explore the next slide. As we will explore, the editor of Chapter 2 utilizes our biological circuitry for predatory detection. It is then projected onto the interpersonal battle of the sexes, thus birthing the intrapersonal. The focal demonstration of Chapter 2 is to distinguish human nature from animal nature, such as the biological struggle to strengthen, develop, and evolve our prefrontal cortex. Indirectly, this is to reject the impulsivity of the amygdala. In this sense, the fruit of the spirit is self-control, what I equate to be delayed short-term gratification. The serpent appears to be a representation of human nature in a manner that is anthropomorphic, a personification. An easy demonization towards the commonly destructive predator makes for an archetype, a maximal motif encompassing all related issues towards death, suffering, and pain, which is thus evil. One thing to note is that also throughout Mesopotamia and many other cosmologies, serpents are typically used as symbols for evil, especially throughout Mesopotamia. So it is a maximal motif encompassing all related issues towards death, suffering, and pain, thus evil. Evil, as we will explore, being also a conscious manipulation of an entity's vulnerability so as to actively engage in exploitation. The serpent falls into the category of the archetype of intellect. In this manner, the caricature of animalism within human nature is represented in figures such as the mad scientist, alien shaman, witchcraft forms of curandero, witches, king's advisors, jesters, clowns, so on. This idea also extends the thought that we do not fully understand our potential for good until we understand our potential for evil. To choose to be naive is not to choose neutrality. It is rather, as Paulo Freire states, to wash one's hands in the blood of the oppressed. The integration of the shadow, as proposed by Jung, solves this biosocial struggle of ours. The serpent, biologically speaking, is the circuitry of our reptilian brain, which produces archaic forms of thought. Notice when the snake seeks to target the woman's identity, it is immediately after she has been purposed as distinct from the animals. Unfortunately, after the fall, Adam renames Eve, switching from the functionlessness of a priori, essence, to function of birther. In a similar manner, Jesus, like woman, is called a son of God, thus pertaining to the bestowing of divine identity before temptation. What is interesting is how, whilst resisting impulsive consumption, both are encouraged to fast, and fasting, signifying sacrifice as delayed gratification. In the wilderness of the unformed world, absent of agriculture, both Isha and Jesus are tempted to have their identity devoured. Here is a demonstration of the serpent as a dramatization of human nature. So I'm titling it Hanachash, the persona or the mask who masquerades declension. So there's a de-evolution that comes with the aspect of the serpent. So it's understood, at least in some sense, that, or at least attributed that the serpent was originally a seraphim. And this brings to mind a very, very critical point, which is that what was the snake or the serpent doing before it was told to crawl on its belly and, in a sense, be a serpent, right? Because snakes obviously don't talk and they don't reason. And so there's these really, really, what I believe to be more accurate depictions of the serpent throughout the Renaissance and medieval periods from a few artists. So you have, for example, the fall and expulsion of Adam and Eve from Michelangelo, and you can notice how the body of the serpent is primarily human, and it's only below the knees that it becomes more like a serpent. And then more towards declension, you have the body of a serpent, the body of this sort of reptile-like creature with hands and legs and a tail, but with the face of a human. And then further down the declension, you have a serpent with simply a whole serpent body, but a human head. And so there's a gradient between human and serpent. And this is very, very fascinating. But then at the bottom of the declension, you have simply a serpent, um, which is you have a serpent which is separate from the persona or the mask of what appears to be a human, right? And so what's so interesting about this is that you have this entity which is able to encapsulate both the floor and the sky. And this may have something to do, this is from flight, or from the realm of the sky to the realm of the floor as an entity perhaps encapsulating both, or at least an entity which moves from one domain to a perhaps lower domain. And this has a, um, this sounds like what is referred to as ingratation. And I have a definition of that here, which is very fascinating. Ingratation is a psychological technique in which an individual attempts to influence another person by becoming more likable to their target. And so what the serpent does is it masquerades itself as something that it's not, um, so as to gain acceptance. And that may be just simply what's happening here. You have a being which appears to be something like a cherubim, something angelic, something, likable, cherishable, but in reality is something else. And because of the lack of object permanence, something very negative is happening. But it's interesting to note simply just the flight to floor, the transition from sky to floor, and how this sounds something similar to ingratation in psychology, and the persona that is associated with this, and persona which in itself is associated with dramatization of human nature. So let's move on. During the process of this, I found this poster. It's pretty funny, and it captures this idea really well. It says, "Don't be fooled," and it's a rattlesnake wearing a pretty little like funny mask face. I forget what it's called, but it's like no matter how sin is disguised, sin is sin. Stay away from it. And in a sense, I actually think this is what the original audience may have seen or thought about, because we can't go back to their society, but it's very likely, like other societies, that um, this is an oral story, and often accompanied with oral stories is entertainment and drama and the usage of masks in order to convey ideas. So we simply may not be able to see a part of entertainment because that has been lost throughout the centuries. However, even though we may not be able to see the original, perhaps the original dramatization in the usage of the mask in the nomadic hunter-gatherer slash agrarian society, we are able to see it to some degree in other cultures. And here's a really cool mask. Here's a double-faced mask representing the duality of man from Zihuatanejo, Guerrero, Mexico. And so it's two masks, and this represents the duality of human beings, the cognitive dissonance, the ego dystonic aspects of human nature. And so what's really, really interesting is that even though um, throughout other cultures you can find a demonic figure which has undertones of animalism, right? So you have a dramatization of human nature, something that is human-like, but then at the same time, it's often combined with reptilian-like animals. You have snakes, bats, um, goat-horned creatures, um, and other serpentine, cat-like, bat-like figures. And this gets at the aspect of dramatizing the human nature. You have in Aztec folklore and mask making, the most old masks encapsulate not necessarily the whitewashed devil masks, but typically you can identify a more rustic mask, a more traditional mask based on its based on its dominant characteristics, having snakes, bats, cat-like creatures. And this gets back a little bit to what we saw earlier with the cat snake bird, as is present in other traditions, which is really cool. So I'm borrowing from a little bit of Aztec and Spanish folklore masks in order to understand the dramatization of what may have been occurring in ancient Israelite society. So we were able to see how there are ancient forms of dramatizing human nature, and there are also modern forms of dramatizing human nature within media today. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier with the archetype of intellect. You have a figure which is able to consciously utilize, consciously manipulate, to exploit an individual's naivety, weakness, in order to gain dominance, right? So you have figures like magicians, which are able to use their skill and their sleight of hands in order to gain dominance, right? So there's this movie that just came out, Black Phone. It was amazing. The guy preys on children, and so he uses this sort of he uses ingratitude in order to appear as a fun, like, loving figure, but is in actuality a devil, and uses, as we see later on, uses the mask of the devil whilst using the personality of a child in order to demonstrate the nature of evil. And that's the same thing that goes with the clown and it. It also ingratiates, right? He lowers himself to this place of stupidity, but is in actuality a demon. He uses tricks and modes of laughter, jokes, forms of, he uses tools in order to gain the favorability of naive children, in order to usurp them and kill them, which is pretty disturbing. But this is the best, these movies are the best ways of demonstrating evilness and the craftiness that comes with conscious exploitation. And we're going to look at evilness a little bit more. But you have other figures, right? So you have magicians, which are closely related to clowns, jesters, right? It's sort of like this idea of beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news, even though they themselves are bringing horror to reality, right? You have the Joker, you have Billy, you have enchanters, sorcerers, you have sort of skinwalkers, you have, in a sense, sort of astrologers, visionaries, which don't necessarily tell the truth, but masquerade the truth. You have the archetype of the king's advisor, and then when you get a little bit more into modern motifs, you have things like doctors, crow doctors. You have people who wear the hazmats, mask suits. I don't even know how to say it, but the biomask suits. You have doctors like in Silence of the Lambs, who convey this idea of evil intelligence. And then on the most extreme end, you have the alien, which is intellect, which is the usage of intellect without any emotionality, pure logic. And there are other various forms of these motifs, but super cool, super cool. And I've contrasted the alien with sort of the skinwalker figure, as you get more towards intricate technology and the doctoral, more scientific motifs. But it's very interesting. But all in all, what we can abstract from these figures is the usage of tools, the uses of ingrattation, masquerading oneself as a form of childlike, stupid, lowly figure, as a persona in order to gain advantage and exploit a more naive, weak figure. And this can actually even also be seen as a philosophy in the art of war. Uh, Lao Tzu proposes to look weaker in order to bring up look weaker, right? It's because when you bring out the dog, they're not expecting the dog, and you get more easily usurped. So really, really cool stuff. I like this stuff a lot. So let's keep going. So the snake is a persona of human nature, right? A mask which helps us understand and identify a particular aspect of our human nature. So I'm coining this apometamorphos, which is the opposite of, it's de-evolution. It's the opposite of transformation, de-transformation, de-evolution. It's the mask behind the mask. And this is the dramatization of object impermanence. And I have a quote which I'm exploring, which is, "Deception is to have never known there still lies yet another persona." So this gets us back at the nature of really what the snake and the serpent is from the standpoint of drama in literature. Pretty soon we're going to look at what a serpent is, what the seraphim serpent like creature was from a biological standpoint, in the feline, the winged feline cat snake bird. So before we move on, I have a few thoughts, and then we'll look at nakedness from a biological standpoint. The final point I want to make on the Nahash, the serpent, is its relationship to nakedness. As we transition into the evolutionary impact of nakedness, biology, and consciousness, all that more, I would say more empirical stuff, but the state of nakedness seems to have not been, quote, raw, unquote, in a sense, the Hebrew word for bad, the opposite of tov, but rather the attempt to change creation by adding to it. If it is not a literal nakedness because it is good to be clothed, then such clothing may be allegorical for something else. If nakedness is allegorical, would not clothing be as well? What then does it mean to cover our nakedness and shame, and why is this not good? Is this an attempt to cover one's vulnerability? And is this then bad? Is this a form of seeking desensitization to our sensitivity, to resist subduing danger as opposed to hiding from it? Perhaps evil is resisting to confront conscious manipulation, like Adam, who was a bystander. To not be sensitive is to decide to address and recognize proponents of suffering. Why is it bad for man and woman to cover themselves? Is this to deny their nature as beings with great acuity? Perhaps this is a form of desensitization, to deny sensitivity to our susceptibility to danger. Perhaps God's design is to make us fragile, so that in such a conscious recognition, we are consumed with confronting danger, therein choosing to do what is good. So yeah, the serpent is an agent of nakedness, which is really a phrase for that which exploits, the trickster, the archetype of intellect. So now we're going to transition into more of the biology, the circuitry of the predator, and the psychophysiology of nakedness. So let's get to it. Psychophysiology. So I'm going to share a few notes, and then I'll just go on through a few slides. Psychophysiology is the branch of physiology that is concerned with the relationship between mental, psyche, in physiological processes. It is the scientific study of the interaction between mind and body. Encyclopedia.com, end quote. Our anatomy, which includes our psychophysiology, entails the manner in which we pose, has a unique relationship to our psychological states. Consider our new upright posture and what it entails. You can see this in the left, to the left. With the lifting of the protective back, we now have exposed soft parts, such as the belly, thighs, loins, and neck, which face no longer downwards, but towards, forwards, environmental threats. In addition to this, we have also developed a favorability towards smoother skin. Thus, we have become further exposed, an anatomical vulnerability, which from a physiological standpoint may have implications towards the psyche. As higher cognition became introduced with our species, predators, danger, disease, and pain were capable of now abstracting common elements into one idea. Ra, the opposite of Tov, is our susceptibility, fragility, and sensitivity, and it sought for itself an acuity which could successfully avoid danger, thus encouraging consciousness, in my opinion. Perhaps then, just as extrinsic awareness grows towards identifying predators, so too one's notion of self indirectly grows in relation to that entity. In this manner, predatory pressures attuned the prey's attention to itself, therein favoring consciousness. Craftiness, then, as a conscious act, is the exploitation of an entity's vulnerability. This is the nature of human evil, which entails a conscious manipulation over the naive youth, the weak and old, the animalistic, and the unattractive. Therefore, the relationship between nakedness and craftiness is between an individual's exposure to conscious exploitation. So think about this, right? Throughout evolution, from a psychophysiological standpoint, we become more sensitive, more vulnerable, more easily able to die, in some sense, at least physically, not necessarily mentally, from most other forms of animals, right? The back is lifted up. So the back protects the belly when it's facing downwards. When you face upwards, the softest parts of yourself are directly facing your predator. You become more of in a sense, you become more prey. So your neck directly faces forward, your eyes, your belly, and your groins, as well as your loins. So literally, and you also shed skin. So you become this supple-like creature which can very easily become cut, very easily become damaged, and die. But in order to compensate for this, it seems as though, for every reaction there is an equal and opposite reaction. And from the law of conservation, it seems as though in order to compensate for this sensitivity, there was a favorability for consciousness, which, for those who were best able to successfully avoid danger, those who could think about the future and not get themselves cut up and die. So imagine some things with me for a second. You're a Homo erectus, and you're thinking about danger. You're thinking about the world around you. You're thinking about whether you're going to die or not. But die within the immediate moment, in close proximity to danger and animals. And so there seems to be this gradient between those who are not successful and those who are successful. And so imagine you're Homo erectus, and you don't necessarily have a very strong prefrontal cortex. And there are other forms of hominids which preceded the Homo erectus. So Homo erectus is not the best example, but let's say you start off with number 1 or number 2. You may not necessarily be as conscious of death. Number 1 doesn't look as conscious of death. Number 2 looks more conscious. Number 3, 4, and 5. But you have a growth of the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with the future, the world of the future, visualization of the future, goals, and that thing. And so there seems to be this motif of those who are animalistic, those who are weak, those who are hairy, like Esau and others, and then those who are not, those who are soft, supple, but smart. And so there's this idea of object impermanence, right? Sort of like a child, where those who don't necessarily have the best prefrontal cortex are sort of sleeping. They don't necessarily have their eyes opened. They don't necessarily think about the future. They're more focused on the immediate moment. The opposite of long-term gratification. The opposite of delayed gratification, more um, immediate, impulsive behavior, versus those who have metacognition, which are able to think about their own thoughts, able to think about the future, able to systematize reality, able to think about how if this domino falls beyond the horizon, there's going to be a domino which falls in the future. And the motif of those who are beautiful, those whose eyes are attractive in some sense, are those who are awake, which is pretty interesting. There's a contrast between, in Genesis, those who are beautiful, and as those who are able to sort of see the future, um, and those who are not beautiful as those who are more susceptible to exploitation. So, from an evolutionary standpoint, you have those who are more animalistic contrasted with those who are more quote-unquote human-like, right? And this is the gradient of human nature that humans are trying to overcome. So imagine, right, you're a Homo erectus or something that precedes a Homo erectus. You're some sort of hominid, and for the first time in your life, you have thought about your impending demise. You understand that you're literally you're going to die. You may not die. You understand that you're not going to die now, because there's no predators around you. But you understand that just like this person around you who has just for some reason fallen asleep is not necessarily asleep, but is dead. And you understand that you too are going to be in that exact same position in the future. And so you're freaking out. You don't understand what's going on, but you nonetheless understand that you are indeed, in fact, going to die. And so that realization is pretty profound, and it seems to have a relationship with through the history of time as people became more familiar with this realization, attempting to better systematize reality in order to prolong that impending death. And that has to do with agriculture and sacrifice, as we will see. But we still need to keep exploring. So as of now, we can now better understand the word arustrachelis, because we have both looked at the dramatization, the persona, the mask of the Nachash, the serpent, and we have looked at the predatorial detection systems and biological circuitry, evolution, the transition of early hominids to Homo erectus to Homo sapien, as well as the growth of the prefrontal cortex and its relationship to causality a little bit. So with these two domains, drama and biology, we can now better understand Aristoteles. So let's look at these translations and contextualizations of nudity and nakedness. You ur to your Adam of Ur when you were unable to be Aram, therefore becoming Ur to the Arum serpent. You wake up to your nakedness of skin when you are unable to be shrewd, therefore becoming exposed to the smooth serpent. So what's interesting, right, is that you have this dramatized evil figure, which is able to think about the future, which is able to manipulate, it's able to exploit people in their supple sensitivity. And so you have this, imagine you have this, you have a winged feline serpent, a cat snake bird with a human head. That's pretty terrifying. And so what the editor is doing is it's encapsulating the worst of both worlds. It's encapsulating our susceptibility to predators and using that as a basis towards the reality of conscious exploitation. It's, in a sense, merging them into the same category. Those who exploit people in their weaknesses consciously, who manipulate people who exploit them, are the body of those who, of animals, in a sense. It's animalistic. And so we have here a very profound and insightful association and attribution of an editor putting together that which is animalistic with that which is exploitative, and it's very interesting. It's very profound. So the actual concrete thing, how this actually ties into Genesis 2 as well, is with the word smooth as an adjective. The word smooth as an adjective slash smoothness as a noun, as of now, appears to best capture both the continuing aspect of nakedness for the sake of both initial emphasis slash attention, as well as shrewdness. Though the texture of the snake is falsely hinted at as a soft, flesh-like, supple exposure, as a word, smooth in English can function essentially as a double entendre, thus initially implying a texture of nakedness for the sake of attention, and in addition to this, on the other end, smooth captures shrewdness, subtlety, and craftiness. So what's interesting is that as chapter 2 transitions into chapter 3, it says, Ve'yihyu sheneham arumim, ha'adam ve'ishto ve'lo yitboshashu. Then in verse 3:1 it says, V'hanahash haya arum mikol hayat hasadeh. Right, blah, blah, blah. So the serpent is arum, the humans are arumim, right? And the word smooth, as is crafty, right? In that context, you hear the word smooth and you're like, what is this? Is this an elongation of the idea of nudity? It's obviously not. In a sense, it sort of is later on. But in a sense, the serpent is also smooth in the sense of subtlety. So it's a beautiful double entendre that can be captured in both English as well as Hebrew. You have arum from aram, and you have smooth from, and you have the word smooth, which can mean both texture as well as subtlety, craftiness. So it's really beautiful, really beautiful. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I have two last thoughts, and then we can move on to the next subject. If it is interpersonal, the passive participle arum is in a sense reflexive, meaning that the internal reptilian id conflicts with the self during cognitive dissonance. Arousal is the exploitation of seduction. Passive participles most often function either as an attributive adjective or a predicative adjective. Passive participles express verbal action in either passive voice or reflexive voice. Passive voice means that the person/thing described by the participle receives the action expressed by the participle itself. Reflexive voice means that the person/thing described by the participle both performs and receives the action expressed by the participle itself, according to Read the Dots. Perhaps these, right, so this idea of, so the word arum itself, I'm speculating, because it's being used in a intrapersonal context means that the action could be used in a sense reflexively, because the entity um, is within the self. So if the self performs an action, it's reflexive. So this passive participle autum could be reflexive, in that when you hear the words, when you hear this passive participle autum as crafty, initially you think, oh, it's a direct object. It's a subject performing an action towards the direct object. But in reality, the subject and the direct object are the same being, because it's the world of the intrapersonal. The human being is a single entity which possesses the id, the ego, and the superego, and all of them affect each other. And so this passive participle is another really, really interesting usage of the editor, very profound, and could, in a sense, be used in a reflexive sense. But I think I've hammered that thought in. We can continue on to the next idea. Perhaps the state of one's barrenness causes consciousness by means of predatory alertness. Skin on an abstract level can be equated, blah, blah, blah. We talked about that a little bit. So the final thought I want to talk about with the snake and nakedness a little bit is yeah, actually no, that was it. That was it. That was it. So now we can move on to the next section. Let's get it. In a very interesting sense, to transition into the next subject of sexuality, we can't talk about predators without talking about sexuality. So let's explore some ideas, and then we'll look at the next slide. Bruh. The phenomenon of consciousness may be attributed to another form of predatory danger, though found within the narrative's abstraction and dramatization of masculinity's relationship to femininity. More specifically, the battle between the sexes within sexual hierarchies. Sexual hierarchies are associated with danger on account of their relationship to death. By subjecting oneself to sexual critique, thus allowing the possibility for rejection, a form of insecurity, fear sort of spreads. Rejection becomes associated with danger, entailing either survival or the lack thereof, to face life or to face death. Sexual hierarchies on a spectrum contain, on one end, either rejection or acceptance. Such leads to either genetic continuity or discontinuity. What brings about this capability for either result is an individual's perceived level of causality/retribution. What an individual chooses reflects their awareness towards the consequential, quote, eternity, unquote, of genetic continuation, or lack thereof, that being genetic cessation of death. To fear death is to move up the sexual hierarchy vis-a-vis permitting sexual criticism and overcoming it. To fear death is to move, however, in order to receive such critique, it is necessarily to be willingly susceptible, vulnerable, and exposed to challenge, so that consequentiality may develop. In some sense, you can't grow without being vulnerable. And on a level of sexual hierarchy and sexual critique, you can't gain the in a sense, the tree of eternity without exposing yourself, without trying to develop yourself. If you stay a child, you, in a sense, you kind of die. And so you need something in order to wake you up, in order to find the drive and the ability to navigate chaos. Because if you can't do that, you won't, an individual won't be able to find favor within the sexual hierarchy. They won't be able to lead the significant other across that chaotic terrain, right? So that's pretty interesting. Another idea within sexuality is the idea of seduction, causality, and metasexuality. To see is to perceive through reality, to have a dream, a vision, a projection of the future. In this manner, to have revelation of the transcendent world, which is to engage in consequentiality, and to cause an opening of the eyes. On the other hand, narratively, to be ugly, old, or naive is in some way figurative for object impermanence. We looked at this a little bit. And therein exploitation. Examples are Adam and Eve as naive youth, whose eyes are open to this shameless nakedness. Noah and Lot, who wake up after having been drunk and molested. Isaac and his cataract old age, tricked by Jacob through his mother as the feminine figure. Unattractive and animalistic Esau, usurped, or more so, hairy and animalistic Esau, usurped by the domesticated and therefore feminine-like, wise, crafty Isaac. Jacob himself, who when in darkness sleeps with poor-eyed Leah, right? Tricked by Laban, and who in the darkness sleeps with an individual whose eye is referred to as being bad, which is really interesting. In addition to this, or when Jacob wrestles in darkness, the inability to perceive, with the mysterious man until sunrise and perception arises. The last I mentioned is Judah, who mates Tamar at a spring named Ai, who, by his cloaked and concealed niece, is tricked. There are many other typological motifs throughout Genesis. The abstraction of all these characters is that exploitation befalls the imperceptive. The immature, the old, the unattractive are vulnerable due to their object impermanence. The animalistic as well. As I carefully state, the animalistic and the impulsive. As I carefully state in accord with the story. Those who die are object impermanent. Those who sacrifice the consequentiality live forever. Perhaps in consideration of sexual criticism, the mythological agent of chaos and death is typically feminine, a perceptual account of reality from the standpoint of the masculine storytelling tradition. Notice how death appears initially through the feminine, so as to approach and confront the masculine. The typology should not be assumed as a demonization of femininity. Rather, we should investigate as to why the editor approximates femininity with exploitation, whilst simultaneously negating sexism. So this motif of femininity and exploitation occurs a lot throughout many other stories. You have Tiamat, you have Eve, obviously the one we're talking about here, Medusa, you have Mamiwata, you have this other Mesoamerican story, and then you have this Buddhist story, I believe, looks like Thailand-like imagery. But yeah, there's this weird sort of relationship. I don't think the editor is trying to bring about sexism. I think he's trying to allegorically or poetically express the most archetypal form of vulnerability from the standpoint of a masculine storytelling tradition, right? The best association I can currently draw is that of seduction. Seduction encapsulates both the element of sexual sensitivity towards femininity, as well as the aspect of conscious manipulation that comes with exploiting the weakness of arousal. In my opinion, the editor is attempting to abstract the nature of exploitation from the sexes, rather than equate a sex with evilness. Here is my thought process. There appears to be a retrospective abstraction moving from the sexual tension of Genesis's relationship to the beginning state of the hermaphroditic Adam. The sexual tension of various interpersonal bonds is abstracted into a metasexuality, and this is to be paralleled with the intrapersonal union of the body and spirit. It is not that the flesh is to be compartmentalized onto the feminine and the spirit onto masculinity, but rather just as man and woman are one, so too the body and spirit. This is to say, union is not exclusive to sexual intimacy. Through the archetype of the androgynous hermaphrodite, which is typically a maximal motif, it does not end with sexuality. Union does not end with sexuality. Here, sexuality is merely the concretization of a greater intimacy / union with something, that something being God. This, as we will explore, is similar to matrices, similar to the archetypes of androgynous hermaphrodites. We're going to look at this later. But in this case, the hermaphroditic motif is used to speak of, in my opinion, a ultimate union beyond itself, hence God as a metasexual state. So now we're going to look at sacrifice. Oh, before we look at sacrifice though, final thoughts. All in all, femininity is not being demonized by the editor in chapter 2. Rather, it's using the archetypal battle, in my opinion, of the sexes in order to the archetypal battle of the sexes found within a man's weakness and sensitivity towards sexuality in order to dramatize the intrapersonal world of the flesh and the spirit, and how the flesh is a manipulative, destructive force. And so it's not, manipulative, destructive force. And the feminine is associated with death, likewise through sexual hierarchies. It's not that the feminine ought to be demonized. It's that the relationship between the feminine can lead to a cessation of being, which is death, which is dramatized into a snake. So it's a lot here. There's a lot here, but it's worthy and it's definitely notable to talk about. So let us move on to sacrifice. The subject of sacrifice is deeply integrated in all these stories and characters. So it's hard to talk about sacrifice exclusively alone without talking about everything else simultaneously. But in this section, we will explore the relationship between agriculture and sacrifice, as well as its relationship to sexuality and the serpent. So history begins with the disintegration of timelessness and the bringing about of time. With time, history begins with impulsivity and the absence of agriculture. Right, so you have the tree of eternal life, right, in some sense, that once that is gone, they enter history, which is a point in time. And at that point in time, things begin with the loss of the garden, the loss of agriculture, or in some sense, history begins towards the transition into, Genesis is strange because it's sort of backwards, but history begins with the absence of agriculture, the absence of a ordered system. And the first focal actions of history are concerned with sacrifice, that being consequentiality, right? You have Cain and Abel. In this manner, an awareness of time brought about an object's causal relationship to other objects. The discovery of manipulation as found in tool usage created systemization for and therein greater reward. Indirectly, in an unconscious and subsequent manner, so too punishment. Punishment then came to be abstracted as, quote, the judgmental father, unquote, in the words of Jordan Peterson, governing the laws of nature and dictating retribution, the one who is the master of causality, is God. Acquirer, who is Cain, is representative for the animalistic nature of man, perhaps assumes his fellow man will not share with him, despite his displacement with being, God. In addition to this, perhaps he speculates, as most farmers would, the catastrophe of a famine without surplus, right? So he didn't, we'll get into it. Impulsively, he destroys his ideal, likewise destroying his potential for systemization and mastery over the environmental, quote, curse, end quote. He is a poor gardener and a terrible farmer, but this does not excuse his decision to kill. He does not explicitly take Abel's resources, but it may be inferred that the nature of his name is shared with those who do. What he himself steals is the archetypal abstraction of life. The acquirer becomes the one who consumes as one reversing the creative order, one returning the figurative vapor back into the ground, the hevel of aid back into the depths of the Adama. That's also a really interesting point. The hevel of aid back into the depths of the Adama. He lives up to his name by catalyzing the pathology for future generations to engage in tribal warfare. Warfare typically involving those who steal resources and obtain plunder. The acquirer then catalyzes into acquirers. The explanation of this multitude is to be attributed to an archetypal first cause, embodied in he who improperly and impulsively obtains, Cain. Right, and that's similar even to Yaakov, usurper. Same mentality, different character. Same mentality, different morphological and phonological name, but in essence, same name. Without sharing in sacrifice, there is no proper economic distribution, meaning that there is no ordered system to facilitate agriculture. Abel's death signifies a return to the state of non-existence and chaos, as well as the starting point from such a place. Those who do not share do not sacrifice, and those who do not sacrifice do not transcend beyond the future. We know that although acquirer does not himself immediately die, his descendants eventually do. Thus, punishment is not always immediate, but it is nonetheless conditional as an inevitable force. On the other hand, one who is keener can envision the future and bring into being a better quality of life. Within an archetypal ultimatum, this is humanity having returned to the Gan Eden. We see that sacrificing the present secures the future. Consequentiality, then, is understood through sacrificing likewise, on a neurological note, to deny the id's limbic system, which is to delay gratification and lean into the superego's prefrontal cortex. The serpent, that also being the reptilian mind, manipulates an understanding of the future by placing the consequence of death as logically dependent upon its immediacy. This mistake is critical and is made simply by negating a paradigmatic understanding of the dual syntactical potential of the imperfect verb, to die. Mot. Mot tamut. Based on context, the imperfect verb can be translated into either a present or future tense. Hebrew does not have 3 tenses, but 2, which are used loosely. Since the connotation of the future tense appears to be unexpressed, the leftover interpretation becomes, quote, because you are not to die in and of this moment, you will not die at all, unquote. The focal emphasis lies between our tense usage of are and will. Technically, the serpent is true according to his word, because they do not die immediately in the moment of their eating, but they do nonetheless end up dying. The majority of our English translations neglect the usage of the infinitive absolute, which, when explicit in English, captures a now present nuance. When combined with the second masculine, with the 2MP imperfect verb die, the phrase mechanically goes something like either to die you will die, or to die you are dead. Now, when it is arranged within a mechanical manner, as is proper English, the not in a mechanical manner. It goes something like either you will not die, or you are not to die. The repetition of die, I speculate, points to the immediacy of the action. Sort of like you're gonna blow up or something. You're not gonna like die as in like blow up right now. You're right, kind of like that. Anyways, though, as I say, the devil's in the details, and death is implicitly conditional, a fine print necessity. He is playing a game of syntax on the subject of time, telling the white lie, you are not to die. Such an implication stresses death in and of this moment to make the argument that death does not exist at all. The serpent is opposed to highlighting its impending necessity because we learn that they do eventually die. It is kind of like saying you won't blow up, implying a death that is instantaneous. So what's interesting, right, is that the snake says you will not die, or you are not to die, right? In and of the moment you eat of it, mot tamut, right? So it can be translated either in our English as either the present or the future tense. I stress that the snake is trying to redefine the syntax of that statement into an understanding of the present tense as opposed to the future tense. And so the snake is saying, you will not die. Like the moment you eat of it, in the moment of you eat of it, you will not die in that moment, right? And so they're like, oh, okay, we won't die at all. Instead, we know that they do die. So he's playing around with the temporal aspect of the verb tenses. So what's interesting is that if Yahweh does state you will die, Beyom echol chamutamut, as in the moment you eat of it, how might we explain this contradiction between the words and the snake? One thing I'm thinking, right, is if God is saying in the day you eat of it, you are to immediately die, or something of that. The archetypal, as that which is the archetypal metaphysical self, Ehye Yahweh, it is as though this future being, who at some point will inevitably experience the present, is speaking from the exact moment of his relative punishment. I speculate he would say something like, if you were to place yourself where I am right now, that being my present and your future, you are dying. You are in the present state of dying. Jordan Peterson mentions how Homer Simpson does something kind of similar to this. He eats poison, and then he says, I'm glad I'm not that guy who's going to die. So there's this misidentification of self as existing in the future. And this has everything to do with what I've been talking about with the prefrontal cortex, understanding oneself within the future. One is oneself in the future, even though it may not be perceptually immediately understood or visualized. So Ehye, so all in all, thus Ehye strengthens the relationship between consequentiality, whereas the Nachash weakens it. So there's a lot here, but essentially here's the thing. The snake is the animal within humans, which is the impulsive thing which cannot conceptualize the future. It only thinks of the present moment, and that aspect of the self, it's the id, it's the amygdala, it's the reptilian mind, it's the limbic system. This entity does not understand long-term gratification. It only understands short-term gratification. And so short-term gratification is the Nachash is contrasted with Yahweh, who understands that there is a consequentiality to the world, understands that there is a necessity for sacrifice, because if you don't give up the present, you destroy the future. And so the rest of Genesis explores this reoccurring idea that those who do not sacrifice the present destroy their own future. And so it's better to sacrifice the present than to sacrifice the future as substituted for the present. Because if you're a farmer, you're going to starve, right? If you're a human being, you're going to die. And this is the relationship between the flesh and the spirit. The spirit is, right, the fruit of the spirit is long-term gratification. It's self-control. Self-control, that is what self-control is. So there's a whole lot that goes into play here. But I think this is what's going on. And with the aid of various resources, Jordan Peterson, Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, many other scholars, some of these things in my perspective are looking true, looking maybe not in some sense completely objectively true, but to me they make sense. So that's it. The final thought of this is that this section is that Ehya strengthens the relationship between consequentiality, whereas the Nachash weakens it. So now let's move on to the Imago Dei. Oh, actually, quick thought. This also has to do with the idea. The final thought I wanted to talk about with these characters, which are typically contrasted with each other, are you have sort of characters which are unattractive, characters which are animalistic, impulsive. They typically have bad eyesight. They're asleep, usually sleeping, or they're unconscious. They're sort of drunk. Are usually those that are contrasted with those who are beautiful, supple, sort of soft and weak, and sometimes even feminine-like. Now, sometimes the characters do typically go back and forth, but I would say for the majority of the time, those who are usurped are typically those who have bad eyesight, are in darkness, are unattractive, are hairy, are animalistic and impulsive. And those ones are typically who are, they're also naked, but are typically usurped by those who are weak, those who are smart, those who are beautiful, and typically even also feminine-like. So that's just something that's kind of interesting to note. And so those who are, in that sense, also those who are able to dream, those who have vision, those who are able to perceive, and those who are best able to sacrifice are usually those who have a more favorable relationship with God. And those who aren't good at sacrificing, and so on and so forth, usually don't have a good relationship with God or with being. So a really cool demonstration of this is in this video, right? You have, in this picture, you have the idea of revelation and the idea of dreams and visions and goals and thinking about the future is that you have the intervention of a transcendent deity working with the present moment. And that could be sort of thought of as the superego helping the ego. You have this thing thinking about the future world, the prefrontal cortex, that which is transcendent, shining a beam into someone's head, so let's move on to the next section. There's this new app that came out. It's called Wombo Art, and it's really weird. I was like, let me try and visualize all these words: Arum, Arum, Arumim, Arum, Ur, all that stuff. Cat, snake, bird, all that. And I was like, let me just type in all these words together and see what happens. Here's the result of experimenting with these words. from this dream-like generator. It's pretty cool. It's a cool app. Womboart.com, www.wombo.art. Check it out. It's pretty cool. But yeah, let's move on. Imago Dei. The Imago Dei, archetypal androgyny, metasexuality, ecstasis, and God. So in this section, I'm going to be exploring divinity. So in one of our conversations, Jordan and I were thinking about perhaps a dichotomy between individualism and collectivism. So individualism, divinity being the image of Yahweh being intrinsic, sort of a singular phenomenon within each person, versus collectivism, which is the image of Yahweh is reflected through the corporal phenomenon within Adam, humanity as a unified whole. Next thought. When Elohim states, "Let us make," such may be spoken from the standpoint of the royal we. Thus the plurality of such may not be polytheistic, but rather addresses the authority and grandeur of the speaker, that being Yahweh. Plural words such as Elohim or Melechim may be associated. It is interesting to note how the LXX states, "Let us make," versus the Aleppo/Leningrad, "I will make." A shift from first person plural to first person singular. Thus, to be made in the image of the one who is divine excludes absolutism and divine right. Perhaps chapter 37 of Ezekiel verses 1 to 14 is a recapitulation of Genesis 2:7, in which the golem of the dry bones has not reached actualization until life is breathed into it. This is a similar motif likewise strikes us. Yeah, that's pretty much it. One thing I was thinking about how the words kenegdo and kidmuteno are pretty similar in usage, and how maybe in some sense, just as let's see. Perhaps just as women and man exist symmetrical to each other, in essence, so too God and humanity in relation to in relation to each other in the first original state. Obviously not through action, but through proximity, I guess, in some sense. Participation. One of the really crucial things I want to talk about is how there's this archetype of androgynous hermaphrodites which seem to precede the creation. Now you typically have this supernatural being which in some sense separates itself to then be made whole again. You just see this motif used throughout various cultures. The mythological archetype of the hermaphrodite, having been once whole and separated, so as to return to unity once again, and once more again. Thus the abstraction of God is found within a metamarital and metasexual abstraction. In my opinion, it is not the intention of the author to advocate for gender role. It is advocating as the archetype the ideal relationship between the grand state of the sexes, neither man nor woman, but both collective sexes, which in their unified totality reflects the corporeal image of the divine. Thus, that is why humanity is made in the image of Yahweh. So in some sense, God is typically the unification of the masculine and the feminine, which is not necessarily in a concrete sense. It's more so to say God is the peace of the sexes amongst one another. It is their commingling, their cohabitat amongst one another. And the flesh and the spirit, in that sense, are the masculine and feminine things which exist amongst one another, and God is the unified masculine and feminine forms of the flesh and spirit, which is pretty interesting. So the archetype of the hermaphrodite is something that is pretty unique. But yeah, let's carry on. And so what I believe this is to be the unification of the flesh and spirit as a sort of hermaphroditic symbol for the unification of the flesh and the spirit. A man and a woman being unified is symbolic for the unification of the flesh and the spirit on an interpersonal level. And so in this painting, you have to the right you have Jesus depicted in an asymmetrical manner, so as to demonstrate the unity of the flesh and the spirit, which are which seem to be two contrary things, or which can be at odds, but through Christ have been unified, which is pretty cool. And in some sense, it is not that the editor is saying that being a hermaphrodite or being androgynous is the way of God. It's more so that there is a state of unity, a state of archetypal unity, which, in a sense, can be perhaps best talked about in intimate terms. The unity of God is best perhaps talked about as a mystical experience itself. The poetry of God can sometimes best be described as sexual. The what's it called? The songs of Solomon, right, are sexual poetry talking about the unification of God and the unification of man and woman. And so it's not necessarily that God is confined exclusively to sex-like imagery, but it's more so used as an instrument towards even beginning to point towards something that is mystical. And so here's the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, sculpted by Bernini, which is pretty cool. Oftentimes I hear that women was taken from man, so women have this role to be, submissive, and men were brought about originally, but obviously from an empirical standpoint, that's just not true, so there's something deeper that's needed to be taken account of. So woman was taken from the side of man, and we have to look at the usage of the word sala, which is the word for rib, as is typically translated. One of his ribs, the word is never translated rib except in this place, but always side flank. This is the true meaning also of the Latin word, by which is rendered the Vulgate, costa, is shown in the French coste. So the argument that Eliot commentary is making is that it's not necessarily the rib, and so she's this sequential object that emerges after the primary figure. It's more so woman is taken from the side of Adam, which signifies a incompletion of being, and so it's more so that woman is this beautiful equal figure, which of course there can be some difference in how each culture chooses to operate, right? But at the end of the day is nonetheless equal in value. And so the word sala needs to be more given more attention. What's also interesting, Cambridge Bible School of colleagues, the word used in Genesis indicating a mysterious heavy sleep sent by God, Hebrew tardema, LXX, ecstasis, Latin sopor, the mystery of divine workings that's hidden from man's perceptions. I think it's interesting, ecstasy. Pulpit commentary says, and the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. This was clearly not a sleep of weariness or fatigue in consequence of arduous labors undergone, but a supernatural slumber, which, however, may have been superinduced upon a natural condition of repose. Lightfoot, following the Elixix, who translate tardema, deep sleep, by ecstasy, ecstasis, imagines that the whole scene of Isha's creation, was presented to Adam's imagination in a divinely inspired dream, which has at least the countenance of Job 4:13. So it's really interesting. Ecstasis, existeme, completely remove, properly take out of regular position, standing, and bring into a state of ecstasy, rapture, like a person, quote, carried out, unquote, in trance-like amazement. The state of mind reaches far beyond the powers of ordinary perception. So it's interesting seeing how woman is, in a sense, sort of hidden from, and there's this dreamlike state where the feminine is hidden from man's initial perceptions, and there's an ecstasis of this mode of creation, which is hidden behind the masculine. But all in all, what's important is that woman is equal to man. Woman is taken from the side of man. And even though it's a rib, obviously it's not an empirical rib. It's a euphemism for equality. And sure, each place, each community in the world can choose what they want to do and how they want to operationalize themselves. But at the end of the day, woman is equal to man. And in some sense, man coming first before woman is not a empirical basis for submission, because obviously that never happened in an empirical sense. So woman is more so an atemporal, is the relationship between man and woman is more so trying to describe an atemporal reality in temporal terms, in poetic timely terms, in my opinion at least. But needless to say, woman is equal to man, and man being created first, in my opinion, should not be used as a way of justifying woman's submission to man, because man, in a scientific sense, was never created first. So yeah, yup. So let's look at Azer Kenegdo. In this section, we're going to be looking at the phrase Azer Kenegdo, which is typically translated as suitable helper. We're going to look at different ways this can be translated, different nuances, and specifically each verb form or noun within the words Azer, Neged, and Bat. So I've been pretty interested in trying to understand the original tense, verb, parsing morphology of this phrase. So I looked at I went to the Dead Sea Scrolls database and found the oldest remnant that is available. And this is Azer Kenegdo. It's 4Q8A Genesis H2. 68 AD, Qumran gave 4. And the phrase is Genesis 2:17 through 18. But you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. And then Yahweh God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. So you can see here the Masoretic. In the green is what's missing. The more yellow color is what's present. And so here if you actually go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can look it up. Here are the actual plate numbers: plate 215, 323, B284244 is the plate number you can actually type in to find it. In the arrows, once you actually click on that icon, you can actually zoom in up close. Here's a more clearer representation of those plates. And then you can actually see it there right under the little ruler, how small the fragment is that contains it. And even zooming in closer. Unfortunately, the top part is not really able to be distinguished, and the infrared scans that they have aren't as updated. The only ones that are present now that I was able to find are from the 50s. But what was really crazy was that I was looking through like 100 fragments of Genesis, and I was able to identify the fragment just by the two single only distinguishable words, which happen to be Ezer Kenegdo, at the bottom. So it was pretty crazy when I found it, because I was looking for about like an hour, looking through at least 100 fragments trying to see which one it was. But yeah, you could see there, Ezer Kenegdo, it's about only 2 inches long, which is pretty cool. But yeah, I want to first talk about the word neged. Um, neged is, in Hebrew, it's an adverb taken from the verb nagad, which means to manifest, or to be conspicuous, to utter, to tell, to come before and tell in some sense. So neged is an adverb, which is very, very critical to note, because how it's typically translated is as a adjective. And what an adjective does, as opposed to what an adverb does, is modify a noun. It gives more of a description towards the noun, as opposed to where the noun is coming into being, manifesting, taking place. So the importance of this is that neged, kenegdo, suitable helper, the phrase suitable helper in itself is the English adjective, which is not really what the Hebrew is trying to emphasize. Um, when we translate suitable helper as suitable, when we translate Ezer Kenegdo as suitable helper, we're really trying to place more emphasis on the state of the helper, what the helper is, as opposed to where the helper is, which is incredibly important. And so what an adverb does, an adverb expresses either time, manner, degree, place, or frequency. Neged indicates where the verb takes place. For example, words like over, under, inside, outside. Adjective modifies a noun by giving a clear description or specification of what something is. So the English translation detaches the adverb from both the prefix and possessive suffix, because typically when people translate Ezer Kenegdo, they just translate it into 2 words, suitable helper. But Ezer Kenegdo is 4 words, not 2 words, as is translated typically in English. Therein attaching it to the noun Ezer and presenting it as a modifier, suitable to helper. This switches the focal attention of the action to emphasize describing the state of the noun as opposed to, more importantly, where the noun is to come to be. Unfortunately, shifting attention from where it is found as to the state in which it is found forms a complication. The subtle though important difference negates the contextualization of the action that so critically hints to show the power of standing before one another, the first experience of companionship. So typically it's translated as suitable helper, and people justify this as a way of culturally appropriating some forms of sexism, in my opinion. I don't really want to get too deep into gender and all that stuff, because that's not my forte. But it is important to note, because more traditional interpreters see suitable helper as a justification for why women are to, wash the dishes, sweep the floor, all this other stuff. But really, suitable helper has nothing to do with more mediocre forms of help. The word really describes more so where the entity is to be found, which is either the dichotomy of the animals, or the domain of the animals, or the domain of man. And so it's a statement of equality. Either a woman is to be found amongst the animals, or woman is to be found amongst man. There's no third category where it's like man, woman, and then at the bottom, animals. It's either, as a dichotomy, woman and man in the same category, or man and then separate from man, women and the animals, right? So grammatically, we speak of kenegdo as though it's a single word. In Hebrew, although it is written as one word, it is in reality a compound of multiple words, fixed to each other. In this case, the prefix kaf and 3ms possessive suffix are written as one word without spaces in between. Kenegdo is a compound composed of the prepositional suffix kaf, adverb neged, masculine 3ms suffix, wow suffix. So Bible Hub translates this quite nicely as, quote, with preposition keneg, according to what is in front of, corresponding to. I will make him an ezer kenegdo, a help corresponding to him, equal and adequate to himself. So essentially, yeah, woman is not to be found amongst the animals. Woman is to be found amongst Adam, amongst a man. And so that is a statement of equality, right? Because it says, right, one thing it also says is that an ezer kenegdo was not found amongst the animals, so therefore must be found amongst man. Some people translate the word neged as improperly. So on a similar note regarding opposition, neged, because neged is an adverb, but sometimes people translate it as a noun in English. So neged can oftentimes improperly be translated with the connotation of opposition or being oppositional. This misunderstanding can be attributed to the dualistic English usage of the word, which can be used to express either placement or state. For example, being opposite of a river versus being oppositional as figurative for defiance. The sexes are not intended by God to oppose each other. In terms of their consubstantiality, they are to be equal. A sex equal in value. A sex may obviously be critically constructive but not adversarial. Interestingly, we will explore the irony of neged later. Through eisegesis, people often use modern terminology from physics to describe the oppositional force, which is then misunderstood in other contexts. So people use the statement in physics that for every reaction there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. It's hard to describe. According to Rabbi David Foreman, in Bema he states that that there's a rabbinical perspective that there is woman and man, they're like two planks. And so people interpret this as within using terminology in physics as a force. For every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so femininity is this opposing force. But then, unfortunately, as seeing it as something more critically constructive, people sort of construe it into more of something misogynistic or sexist, and view femininity as this opposing force, as opposed to a force that is more critically constructive. So I try and steer away from the word opposing, because it can just, that cross-reference terminology using modern terms with ancient terms just doesn't do well. Rabbi David Foreman also tried to translate helper or we'll look at that later, helper. Yeah, we can look at that later. So yeah, pretty much neged, we should place more emphasis on where the helper is to be found, not necessarily what the helper is. And this will actually, in some sense, ironically help us find out what the helper is because the helper is in the place of equality. The helper is equal, based on the statement of where it is not found, which is not amongst the animals, but with man. So yeah, let's look at the word azer now. So Rabbi David Foreman tries to translate the word azer, which is typically translated as helper, as a power equal to himself. So the problem with power is that it's more of an abstract word. Um, it's more of an abstract word. So Dr. Stephen Francois, Dr. Stephen Francois tries to tackle this idea. But, quote, "It is a fusion to produce a new word. It could not therefore be either to save or to be strong, because this new product would be different. Syriac and Aramaic is translated likewise, blah, 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 means, okay. Dr. Stevens says, quote, "This means the original pronunciation of Azer would still likely have been known at the time the LXX was translated. The LXX translates the word helper as Bo'ethon, 998, which means helper, corresponding thus to Azer 1. According to Miller's article, there are no abstract references to human beings as, quote, a power, unquote. The word Azer in Genesis 2:18 comes from the Proto-Semitic root azar, which is the same as azar, one, meaning to help, succor." So, yeah, humans being referred to as power isn't necessarily true. It's not ancient, at least. It's not necessarily ancient. God is, in a sense, referenced as power, because he is the word Elohim, El meaning power. So perhaps, God is trying to bring humans into a state of power. However, the terminology doesn't necessarily add up. So Azer is a masculine noun. It means help or helper, from azar, meaning to help or succor, a primitive root to surround, protect, or aid. Azer, as a noun, quote, "is always used in the context of the Old Testament during vitally important and or powerful acts of rescue," unquote. So when people use the word suitable helper, they usually use it as a more mediocre form of help, like I need help doing the dishes, I need help sweeping the floor, I need help doing the laundry. How are you being used as a helper, right? People address women as, are you being a good helper, right? As sort of a more passive entity. Rather, the word azer should be used more so as savior, aid. The best translation, in my opinion, is succorer, right? The bringing forth of the azer in our modern mind could be thought of as the severity of a situation when an ambulance is driving as fast as it can to the hospital, right? An ambulance, in a sense, would be your azer in a situation where you're dying, right? So it's usually used during times of military rescue and very severe forms of salvation. So azer shouldn't be thought of as a mediocre form of help, as in doing household chores or whatever. It should be thought of more so as salvation, more so as rescue, more so as as a succorer, because helper, I nailed that down. So helper in that sense. Now let's look at the word bad, and then after this we'll abstract everything. The word bad, which appears in Genesis 2 as lavado, is defined in Bible Hub as separation or apart. From badad, properly separation by implication, a part of the body, branch, a tree, adverb, alone, apart, besides, blah, blah, blah. So Adam, in a sense, exists separate from something else. He is a part of something. And in a sense, he's referenced, he can be recognized as his own being. But through the lens of functional ontology, he doesn't necessarily fully exist yet, because he doesn't, because he's just a piece of something, right? An engine isn't fully an engine when you consider just simply a lug nut or something like that. Or a tire isn't necessarily a tire when you take off a lug nut, right? Like, you can reference the lug nut, you can reference Adam, but Adam isn't fully itself a tire without the addition of something else. And a tire cannot properly be a tire if it's not able to function, right? So Adam doesn't necessarily even exist as an entity through the lens of functional ontology without the bringing forth of the succorer, the Azer. Yeah. So what's so important is that man is enamored first with who woman is, not with what she can do. Adam needs aid not because by his own will alone he is insufficient, thus necessarily requiring another, but because by his own isolation he cannot be his own company. An ontological state completely unrelated in nature to performance, work, or exertion. Yeah, I'm going to say that again. Adam needs aid. Adam needs an Azer, not because by his own will alone he is insufficient, thus necessarily requiring another. He needs a more few hands on deck to wash the dishes or do whatever. Thus necessarily requiring more help. But because by his isolation he cannot be his own company. This is an ontological state completely unrelated in nature to performance, work, or exertion. So Adam does not need help to do something. He more so needs help to be something. Yeah, Adam needs help not to do something. He needs help to be something. And this help cannot be made through means of how much work he even could do, because he would be in the garden for forever. He would have an eternal amount of time to work. It's more so beyond even his ability to do something. And this is, again, the providence of God. This is only an act of God, where by something else's means of exertion, which is in a completely different ontological state, all right? Because you can't work to be your own company. You can't become your own company, right? You need the work. You need the work of God in order to bring you something, right? Because you can't create your own company. You can only be bestowed company, and that's what Adam needs aid in. He needs aid in having company, right? So that's what's really important. So the way that I translated Kenegdo mostly is mostly that I will make of him a succorer as one who is corresponding him as himself or to himself. So yeah, pretty much when we focus, the last thought on this section is that when we focus on Neged, it places less emphasis on the state of the entity and more so where the entity is to be found. In this case, Azer is to be found in the presence of Adam. Azer is not to be found in the presence of the animals. And so what this means is that because it's a dichotomy, because she is not an animal, she is equal to man. And there's no threefold sort of declension where it's Adam, or it's man, and then lower to man, it's woman, and then lower to woman is animal. No, it's a dichotomy. It's either you're an animal or you're in the same category of man as a human. So there is an equality that is demonstrated by this dichotomy. And then in addition to this, Azer, should not be translated as a mediocre form of help. It should be translated more so as a succorer. And in this sense, this form of help cannot be met through means of any form of human work, any form of human exertion. This help is in a completely different ontological category. And Adam does not need help to do something. He needs help being something. And this being can only be met through God's providence. And so it doesn't matter what man can do. It really matters more so what God can do in this sense. So I think I've nailed that down. I think I get a little bit more descriptive and all that stuff in my notes, but yeah, let's move on. We're going to return a little bit to functional ontology and nomenclature, and how names and being named has a relationship to existence. So I'm just going to go through my notes. There is an argument which proposes that because Adam was created first, or man, this alludes to his authority over woman. However, how can we account for this from an evolutionary standpoint? It appears as though we cannot. It is also said that because Adam names Eve, this also points to his authority. He does in fact name Eve, but only after the fall. He names Eve after the fall. And Adam is more so man than it is human, right? Than it is Adam as more of a thing. He does in fact name Eve, but only after the fall, a title focusing on what she can do in contrast to who she is. Man does in fact refer to this new being as woman. However, this may be more of a form of recognition to something already aforementioned. The name woman, Isha, occurs first in the context of the work of Yahweh, and second after man. Right? So God says, when he's forming woman, he said, the scripture in Hebrew goes, Vayiven Yahweh Elohim et hatzela asher lakach min ha'adam le'isha. Right? That's the end of that verse. And then it goes on to the next verse, and it says, Ve'yavi'eha el ha'adam, vayumer ha'adam, zot ha'am, etzem me'etzamai uvesar mivesari, lezot yigare isha. So she will be called woman, right? So in this sense, it's almost as though Adam is recognizing what God has named her, which is pretty interesting, especially considering that the verb is masculine. It's almost as it's like he will be called. Yeah, it's really interesting. But anyways, the word Isha first comes up in the context of the work of God, and then sequentially later through explicitly in the reference of Adam. So to my speculation, this mode of implicit naming from a functional ontological perspective is the bestowing of Yahweh's essence and thus synonymous for her existence. In this sense, although man explicitly calls a woman by her name, he does not himself create her, but more accurately recognizes her, demonstrating his level of articulation to be aligned with that of Yahweh. Her name at this point is independent of her work, indicating a break in transcendence from functional ontological identification to a posteriori essence. Yeah. Within Hebrew culture, we have explored how naming typically demonstrates one's essential behavior, character, archetype, function, and or role. In addition to this, we saw how it is important to analyze the affairs leading to the context of the name. The state of the environment can serve as an indicator to the nature of the name. It is critical to note that only in relation to woman that the name man, ish, is likewise mentioned. We are able to hear and observe the phonological symmetry between ish and isha. It is out of his proximity, by means of a reference point, that his own relativity may be measured, thus indirectly obtaining his name as man. Let me drink some water. This is important. This is important. He is called into a deeper notion of individuality vis-a-vis his exposure to the new ontological experience of plurality. The ability to base oneself off something and for there to be relativity, distinguishability, and differentiation are now capable. The name and their own identity forms through a mutual edification, where for every reaction there is an equal and opposite reaction, capable of defining both parties. The names of woman and man, husband and wife, man and woman, are both dependent upon one another for their own existence, since you cannot have without one another. A wife without a husband without a wife. In my opinion, this existential dependency points to our biology and therein our evolution into highly social beings. Marriage, then, being archetypal for the greatest form of companionship, is abstracted to dramatize our collective dependency for socialization. As we discussed throughout some recordings, Jungian person. We looked a little bit at Jungian personality, how people bring out people, and in some sense, it's interesting. Man and woman, wife and husband, their separation, but also their unity, leads us back again into the mythological motif of the hermaphrodite, and the metasexual abstraction of God. So, all in all, what I'm saying is that, sure, Adam names Eve, but Adam only names Eve, Eve, and it's only Adam as Adam naming Eve, Eve, in chapter 3. Rather more so in chapter 2, it is man that names woman, woman, only in relation to his naming of her. So in the sense, there is a mutual edification through the nomenclature of functional ontology. And so by man naming woman, or by man naming woman, woman in some sense also brings about a relativity to the emergence of man. And so in a sense, it's like as man names woman, sort of, woman names man. And obviously not explicitly, but there's a mutual edification. It is by their relativity that a deeper, a form of dependency, of ontological dependency emerges. And so you have, because all this stuff is being talked about in atemporal things are being talked about in a temporal manner. Essence, abstract essence, which is atemporal, right? Things which exist by necessity, which cannot not be, implying that they're not contingent, which is dependent on the temporalness of time, are trying to be talked about in a sequential human temporal manner. And so really you have the abstract, you have abstract absolutes being talked about through a series of actions, which can get a little bit confusing. But the most foundational and critical and beautiful thing is that you have the emergence of the explicitness, the ability to be mentioned of man, of husband in relation to wife and woman. And so, right, the word wife only exists in relation to a husband, and the word husband only exists in relation to a wife. And so you have this ontological dependency and this beautiful edification. And so woman, in the way I view it, is that woman exists only in relation to man, but also man only exists in relation to human. Just as a wife exists only in relation to a husband, so too, a husband only exists in relation to a wife. And there is a beautiful abstraction and mutual edification that is brought about through this process. So, yeah, that's really it on Isha and Isha. Let's move on to the next section of pluripotentiality, which aims at focusing, well, what does this entity look like before the differentiation, before the relativity and individuality comes into being. So let's get to it. I'm just going to read my notes and then I'll synthesize it. In this section, I'm exploring new ontological category, which I propose to have preceded the dualistic state of both individuality and plurality, in some sense. I first want to look at the definition of pluripotent, as this currently best explains my theory. The pluripotency of biological compounds describes the ability of certain substances to produce several distinct biological responses. Pluripotent is also described as something that has no fixed developmental potential, as in being able to differentiate into different cell types, in this case, pluripotent stem cells. So in this sense, you have Adam, or you have Adam, which is sort of this hermaphroditic figure, which is neither male nor female, but is something encapsulating the essence of both, but not either male or female yet, but is best represented by the symbol of that which is androgynous, that which is hermaphroditic, right? But is not yet either or. It's not both male or female, because technically male and female have not come into existence. It is both the substrate of what is both male and female, right? And so the substrate is what I want to look at. In a sense, it's actually kind of the form of these two beings. But what is the state that precedes the distinction before the material essence of that entity? It seems as though this material is sort of ineffable. If it's referenced as Adam, but from a biological standpoint, it's kind of difficult to think about, right? And I think to some degree, or at least I want to vocalize, it's interesting to note how the medieval and Renaissance codices depict Adam as a hermaphrodite, which is pretty interesting. Which what I speculate to be neither male nor female, but the symbolic representation of those two things, substrate. It's the substrate. In the sense prior to a dualistic emergence, I assume that because it became something, it was once something, it is now not, at least materially. As it transitioned states, it was recognizable, but not fully expressive through functional ontology, and therefore figurative for truly existing from the lens of FO, functional ontology. Adam, in this pluripotent state, existed in a separate ontological category, distinct in form from its sequential development into woman and man, containing the essence without having yet actualized. Adam in this state may be recognized, though not fully expressive and capable of creative participation. On a similar note, as quoted from a previous podcast episode, quote, "You can't simultaneously be Ish and Isha, but you can be an Adam and an Isha." Next thought. The 3ms passive verb yikare, translated as, quote, "she will be called," unquote, is perhaps inconsistent with the grammatical masculinity that it's addressing in that moment. It may be that the editor is using concise grammar to unpack some form of consequentiality, in this sense to equate materially the masculine with the feminine. He is called woman because from man she is taken. This is to address in time what something is before it is transformed and redefined, taking the masculine material, addressing the masculine material, and which once addressed later becomes feminine. So for example, right, when it says lazot yikare isha, the verb it will be called, in English it's translated as gender neutral, just simply it. It's neither male or female. Sometimes in English it's translated as she will be called, but actually the verb is technically a 3ms, third masculine singular passive verb. And in English it could be translated as either it will be called or, which is pretty interesting, he will be called. So it says, so Adam says, this now is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. He will be called woman, right? Now the audience of Genesis could be inferring that it's a neutral noun, but what's most peculiar about this is that most things that are neutral, that are inferred as neutral nouns, are typically inanimate. What's so unique about this specific occurrence is that it's talking about not an inanimate subject, but an animate subject, something that is living. So it's very peculiar um, why the author wouldn't choose to address it as a grammatically exclusive feminine form, but something that possesses um, syntactically a masculine form, but paradigmatically a feminine form. And so it could be used to address in time what something is before, after it has been called. So to address its masculinity, and then once addressed, it is later feminine. Or it could be, I was going to say something about God. I was going to say something about God calling it something. I'm not really sure. Dang it, I was going to say something. It's going to be good. It's going to be contrast. Maybe I'll find it out later. But it's weird. The yikare verb is pretty strange. Oh yeah. Okay. So it could be either referring to something as it is in its state, and then once that verb is past tense, then it is feminine. Or um, dang it, did I just forget again? I did forget again. Or dang it, man, come on. Um, Come on, God, help me out. I was gonna say either you address it in time. It's having to do something with mutual emergence. Um, okay, I remembered. So it's either that Adam, or no, it's either that um, to address something as it is in the moment of addressing it, um, which does not, which does not yet include the passive tense, um, or which does not yet include the completion of the action, which once complete and is of the past tense, becomes feminine. So it's to address it as masculine in the moment that it's being addressed, right? Because it's not yet feminine after it's addressed, right? Until after it's addressed. So it's either that, or it's Adam recognizing what God is calling it. So maybe in some sense, the yikare could be more so translated as Adam saying, this is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. He calls it woman. He calls it woman. Yeah, it would be this is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. He calls it woman, referring to God, who implicitly forms women in his context first, right? Um, Because in some sense, right, woman, or because in some sense, Adam didn't even name himself. Adam, Adam takes the name Adam in, Adam takes the name Adam, right? Human takes the name, or man, or the first man takes for himself the name Adam as a sort of figure. But in chapter 1, right, Adam is named Adam, or humanity, or Adam is named Adam by God from the verb demut, right? When God says, Na'asa Adam betal menu kitmutenu, right? So Adam himself doesn't even name himself. God names Adam. So in some sense, it's almost as though God names man and God names woman, which is to say that both man and woman are equal in some sense, or equal in that shared substrate. So another thing was translating Zot Haba'am, which is a cool little thing. But now let's move on to egosyntonic versus egodystonic. As again, I'm going to read my notes and then abstract it. Mythology is often described as ancient psychology. Here I am exploring and comparing some modern psychological terms with actions in the fall of humanity. I will begin by defining egosyntonic, egodystonic, and cognitive dissonance. Egodystonic, number 1. Being aligned with egosyntonic, number 1. Being aligned with one's own personal goals, values, and belief systems in integral harmony. Number 2. Egodystonic, the opposite of egosyntonic, in which a person is not aligned with their goals, values, or belief systems. Cognitive dissonance. Number 3. To my understanding, a synonym for egodystonic, cognitive dissonance, quote, psychological conflict resulting from incongruous beliefs and attitudes held simultaneously. Merriam-Webster, end quote. The man and his wife hide themselves from God. Now the word, quote, where are you, end quote, echa, implies more of, quote, why are you not where I left you, unquote, as opposed to the problem of omniscience concerning, quote, how could an all-knowing God not know the state of his creation, unquote. I want to focus on the realm of their self-imposed object impermanence to Yahweh. To flee from the face of God is to flee from the transcendent/metaphysical self. Christ, which archetypally is the abstracted human ideal human. In these terms, it is one's best self, thus abandoning the Christification of theosis. In forfeiting to sacrifice the present self for the future, disharmony and misalignment are natural consequences. On a similar note, perhaps to peer into the face of God, that which is one's transcendent self, is to see one's own life or death. Hence, that is why one dies when seeing God. It is to see one's end. As a possible recapitulation, Moses seeing the face of God may have been originally intended for man and woman to fulfill. And this is similar to the allegory of the 4 rabbis entering parties. Lived truth is like egosyntonicity, whereas living non-truth is cognitive dissonance. Perhaps symmetry of self is best reflected by living out our goals and values. To incarnate the world is to remember our self-image, to be symmetrical with ourselves as opposed to forfeiting what we look like. Either the self faces itself, maintaining participation, egosyntonic, or it becomes no longer itself, a fragmented piece, ontologically different from the first authentic self. The misalignment of power amongst the dramatized subpersonalities is a struggle for representation. In Freudian terms, the superego versus the id, that which sacrifices for the sake of consequentiality versus that which demands the immediate. In Jungian terms, the necessity of the intended integration of the shadow in order that so goodness dependent on conscious will might exist. So what I'm saying is that maybe when Adam and Eve in chapter 3 flee from God, in a sense they're fleeing from themselves. right? In a sense, maybe they're fleeing from themselves. And so this fleeing from the self is the cognitive dissonance of the interpersonal world. It is moving from that which is egosyntonic to ego-dystonic. And so the ego is now having to fight between the two worlds of the um, is now having to fight between the two worlds of the superego and the id, right? The flesh and the spirit. And perhaps in some sense for, right, so God, which is Christ, which is from a Jungian term, which is the ideal self, to flee from the face of God in some sense is to flee from one's best self. And so by fleeing from one's best self, one forfeits a figurative death of self, which leads to a figurative eternal life, right? And so by fleeing from the face of God, one chooses death as opposed to facing the face of God and facing oneself and choosing life, contending with being, contending on the archetypal maxim of being, right? So that's pretty much egosyntonic versus ego-dystonic. That's one thing I'm exploring. We're going to explore this. We're going to come back to this in chapter 3, or in the next video probably. But yeah, to flee from the face of God perhaps is to flee from oneself, and to not face God is to not face oneself, because to not face that which is transcendent is to choose to be immediate, is to choose to be impulsive, is to choose to be an animal, which does not think about the future self, which at the end of the day is still not thinking about oneself. So I think I've hammered these ideas in a little bit, just to get them documented. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Last subject is, or actually no, we have gender and modernity, and then we have thoughts and tangential questions. I'm not going to go too deep on this subject because it's not my forte, as I've mentioned, but we're going to be looking at distinguishing sex and gender. So this whole thing, right, we've talked about azer kenegdo, not translating it as suitable helper, but rather a succorer as one corresponding as himself, right? The significance of this is that Genesis chapter 2 should not be used as a justification for traditional gender. In my opinion, if Genesis 2 were to talk about gender, it would talk about the disintegration of gender, and rather more so seeing each other's value, not in what we do, but in who we are. And so Adam and Isha and Isha, husband and wife, are not, ought not to be thought of as ontological states dependent on their function to one another, but more so their abstract existential dependence upon one another, right? Positive and negative, right? It's we looked a little bit on, yeah, pretty much, yeah, their abstract dependence upon one another. And so one thing that I think about is, right, like, I'm gonna share some notes, and then I'll abstract it. Gender and modernity. In light of the ancient customs of a patriarchal society, and gender used to emerge from the nomadic and agrarian life, what do we know now that we're in a different state? Should men take the responsibility upon themselves to refer to themselves as the head? It is not as much a mystery if Paul were not referring to the interpretation of the body and the spirit. If the body were to be referred to as the feminine and the head to be referred to as the masculine, that being the spirit. It may be inferred that the soul or being of an individual is composed of two dualistic parts, right? The soul is both spirit and flesh. If the flesh is ascribed as the body of Christ, which is then ascribed to female, is not the spirit, which is the head of Christ, ascribed to ruling the flesh? Does not everyone make up the body of Christ and so exclude the title of head for Christ alone? It is not that the spirit rules the body, so too woman is ruled by man, right? So, hold on. It is not that as the spirit rules the body, so too woman is ruled by man, but rather as the spirit rules the flesh, so too each part of the body of Christ is ruled by the spiritual head. No man can be Christ. Each significant other is to be called to equally die to themselves under Christ. For we do not own our own bodies, and not force upon one party to bear what only one man, Christ, could do. Christ is Christ. Christ is not both Christ and myself, right? I do not call myself Christ. Christ dwells in me, right? But I am not myself completely Christ. This does not at all negate an individual's effort. We must each make every effort to die to ourselves. Instead, we should not reserve decision-making, as in being completely Christ, to one party as the head, but be in a mutual state of compromise with our spouse or significant other. So to me, it makes sense. Right, the consequence of man ruling over woman is a consequence. It's not how things ought to be, right? Man should not rule over woman. That's a consequence of sin. Man and woman should be in a state of mutual compromise with one another. And so the flesh and the body, the spirit should rule the flesh, right? The spirit should rule the spirit should rule the flesh. The spirit should rule the flesh. But a man should not rule over a woman, in my opinion. Because, right, like Christ. Okay, here's what I'm trying to say. My brain's getting a little foggy. So Paul talks about how Christ rules over the body, right? Just as the spirit rules over the flesh. However, if everyone is the body of Christ, that means that not everyone is the head. So if everyone is the body, that means that they cannot be both the body and the head. So therefore, there is an exclusive role that still needs to be brought into play. And that exclusive role, in my opinion, is Christ, right? Because it says only Christ can be the head. And if everyone makes up the body, then everyone is therefore the body, not the head. And so sin, the result of sin is men ruling over women. It's the fact that it is because the flesh has ruled over the spirit that now that men rule over women. It's not necessarily that because the flesh rules over the spirit that men more ideally should now, in order to combat what has happened, the masculine should rule over the feminine. More so because the flesh has ruled over the spirit. It's more so, it's because the flesh rules over the spirit, that in that manner, in the same action as the flesh rules over the spirit, men rule over women. And the same could be said, as the flesh rules over the spirit, women rule over men. Rather, the flesh and the spirit should be in a perfect state of harmony, within God's temple. And in my opinion, women and men should equally die to themselves to Christ. It's not up to the man to be Christ for the woman, right? Because each human being has a responsibility to take up their cross daily. It's not for one specific party or one specific member. It's too much for one man to bear. That's why one man, Christ, had to bear it. So I think that's just some things that need to be taught, that ought to be contemplated as we move into, as we are leaving an agrarian society and have now entered, modernity. So yeah, we should distinguish sex and gender from one another. And we should also distinguish our ontological state from our sex and gender as well. And to be a wife and to be a husband does obviously include, in the day-to-day life, someone does chores this day, someone does chores that day. But being a Isha is not dependent on what Isha does. It's dependent on who she is, right? Because when Isha became dependent on what she did, she became Chava. When Isha was dependent on who she is, or when woman became dependent on who she is, she became Isha, or she is Isha, right? Same can be said for man. When man becomes dependent on who he is Ish. But when man becomes dependent on what he does, he becomes Adam. And not Adam humanity, I'm talking about Adam as a caricature. So yeah, sex, gender, ontology, Ish and Isha, remembering value, all that good stuff. So now we're just going to look at our final section on last thoughts, and then we'll be done. All right, here is our last section. We're going to be looking at just some questions. Should Genesis 1 through 2 be read backwards? That being, we would transcend history when we sacrifice and become hermaphroditic, the metasexual state. Not hermaphroditic in a literal, biological sense, but in a symbolic, metaphorical sense. Does the snake eat humans in their death? To turn to dust whilst the snake eats the dust figuratively, meaning the reptilian brain is self-destructive, self-consuming, right? For humans to return to dust and for the snake to eat dust, when in the context of that which is interpersonal, it seems as though the snake is self-destructive and humans consume themselves, right? So does the snake eat humans in a sense? And are we eaten by the snake? When they eat from the tree, do they break Sabbath? Gaia theory. Creation is an anticipation for the restoration of nature. Does nature demand a sentient being in order to guard and protect it? A law of conservation, where nature gives up its consciousness in order to produce a highly conscious being in order to protect it. Equilibrium and homeostasis when danger arises. Intelligently forming self-protection and self-conservation. Creating predator and prey in order to diversify and increase chances of longevity. Does functional ontology play a role with the nomenclature of Hava? We've actually already answered this. Yes. Is there a phonological relationship between skin, light, Hebrew, or? So we've talked about or, but we haven't talked about the relationship between or as light and or as skin. Both being pronounced the same, both spelled differently, one being spelled with aleph, one being spelled with ayin. What's up with the relationship between a father leaving his house as opposed to a woman leaving his house? Does the Bdellium of chapter 2 have anything to do with the words such as Nishmat Chayim, Boshem, and Vayashem? Right, you have a fragrant gum which has connotations of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, fragrance, smoke, sacrifice, things of that nature. And does that have a relationship with value? Um, for example, primarily speculation. That's whatever. We looked at the things in the adverb. Oh yeah, is God ironic when he tells Adam, "Who caused to neged you?" after creating his neged? Seems um, sort of suspicious. Kind of. It seems very ironic. Um, is there an exploitation of the 2ms you and 3fs she, when which the snake implies with the verbs mot tamut, right? Because the verb tamut can be translated either as you will die or she will die. So is God saying something like, in the day you eat of it, she will die? In the day you eat of it, you will die? Or is the snake saying something like, um, in the day you eat of it, you will die, so when you eat of it, you will not die, talking to the female, but if you give it to your husband, he will die, right? Or something weird like that, because the 2ms and the 3fs are both pronounced the same, spelled the same, are grammatically the same, but paradigmatically are different. And that is it. Guys, it's been an amazing journey. There's still going to need to be some exploration. This video is 3 hours. It's crazy long. But God's word is beautiful. And God's word is eternal. And, I'm just one guy talking to a bunch of guys, talking to a bunch of girls to try and understand, what's really going on. I'm just one person, in history. Some things triggered you, some things triggered you. And, I'm just trying to pursue truth. I'm not trying to, um, my intention is not to step on anyone's toes, obviously. Um, I'm just noticing things as someone who happens to study Hebrew and has been studying Hebrew. So, I don't really, I'm not here to try and, um, justify myself on all these potentials. But I am here to explore. And I dedicate this video to exploration and to God, and to those of you who in the future, or who may even possibly now, be interested in exploring more deeply God's Word, Genesis 2. So it's been an amazing journey. It's been a very long journey. I've been studying Genesis 2 for about 2 months now, memorizing it in Hebrew, verbatim in Hebrew. And there are so many things that are interesting. So that'll conclude this video. Shalom, guys. May God be with you. May peace be with you. And may you be with yourself. So, peace. Hope you guys have fun and enjoy life. Shalom. For this video, my works cited is included in the link in the description. So you can access that there. Thank you.